Hello there, James A. Wisher back with you again, this time with Children of Junk, the third book of my Rogue Star science fiction series. I hope you're excited for the next installment of Marcus, Solomon, and Ayeka's adventures. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the videos. If you're ready, here we go.
Chapter 1. Marcus Drake reclined beside the glittering blue water of the resort pool, the comfort form chair perfectly molded to his lean, rangy body. Off to his right, the steel and glass hotel gleamed in the sun. He took a deep breath, enjoying the scent of flowers in the air. This was the third day of their 2-week vacation on Pleasure Planet 4, all expenses paid by the Council as a bonus for their work helping stop the Children of the Void and later rebuilding the Council asteroid. Marcus had no idea how much it cost, and since he didn't have to pay, he didn't care. But it had to be a lot given the luxury of the suite he and Ayeka shared. Solomon got a smaller room to himself next door to theirs. He sighed. Solomon seldom left the virtual reality arcade except to sleep and eat. Well, this was his vacation too, so he could spend it however he liked. From behind his shades he watched as females from half a dozen species swam, lounged, and displayed themselves in the skimpiest swimsuits their anatomies would accommodate. The heat of the tropical, satellite-controlled weather made anything heavier than the light trunks Marcus wore uncomfortable. In a matching chair beside him, the most beautiful woman at the resort, and by good fortune his girlfriend, sipped a neon blue drink. Ayeka wore a red bikini every bit as skimpy as anything he'd seen on the other women, and every time he glanced at her, he got a warm feeling, and not in his heart. Ayeka glanced at him when a particularly well-endowed humanoid female with multicolored feathers in place of hair sauntered by for the third time. Marcus tried his best not to react to her, but Ayeka's raised eyebrow indicated he didn't succeed. He turned his head and pulled his glasses down and looked over the top of the frame. "It's not my fault she keeps walking by." "Maybe if you stopped looking at her." "I close my eyes every time she goes by, I swear." Ayeka shot him a mock scowl. "Liar." Marcus grinned. "You know me too well." "How much do you suppose she charges?" She waved a fist at him. "Less than the doctor you'll need if you keep staring at her." He laughed, pushed his glasses further up on his nose, and settled back in his chair. He might like to look, but Marcus loved Ayeka. Not that he told her or anything, but he couldn't stop thinking about her when they were apart, and when they were together he smiled all the time. If that wasn't love, it was a close approximation. "Marcus!" He leapt out of his chair at the sound of Solomon's voice. Something had to be wrong if Solomon was anywhere near the pool. His best friend and navigator, dressed in long black pants and matching, baggy, oversized t-shirt, both soaked in sweat after his walk from the arcade, couldn't have looked any more out of place among the fit, almost naked people by the pool if he had on a parka and ski goggles. "What is it? Something wrong with the ship?" He'd left Gruesome, his modified Void Warbot, on guard mode, so he doubted anyone had messed with the star. Gruesome had enough firepower secreted about his alloy body to win a small war on his own. Still, you just never knew. Solomon blinked and shook his head, sending his mop of shaggy blonde hair flopping back and forth. "The ship's fine as far as I know. I have a more personal problem, and I need your advice." Marcus sighed and sat back down. "Shoot." "One of them found me. She wants to meet for drinks, and I'm not sure what to do." Ayeka came over and sat beside Marcus. Having her perfect bronze leg pressing against him made it hard to concentrate. Lucky for him, Ayeka asked the question he'd been struggling to put together. "Who found you?" "One of my fans. None of them have ever tried to meet me face to face. I'm not sure what to do." Marcus ran his fingers through his hair. It seemed like nothing, but to Solomon this was a big deal, so one of his usual sarcastic replies wouldn't cut it. "What do you want to do?" Solomon just stared at him, unmoving and not blinking, like a computer in need of a reboot. "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you what I should do." "If you want to meet her, I say go for it. If you don't like her, it's not like someone's holding a blaster on you and forcing you to stay." Solomon chewed the inside of his cheek, then nodded once. You're right. I'm going to meet her. Thanks, Marcus. Without waiting for a reply, Solomon spun and stomped back toward the comfort of the hotel. Marcus hoped Solomon remembered to shower before he went to meet his date. He yawned and ran a casual hand along Ayeka's leg, earning him a light punch to the shoulder. Solomon has fans? Ayeka's incredulous tone didn't surprise Marcus. If there was a less likely person to have a fan club, Marcus couldn't imagine who it would be. You wouldn't think it, but Solomon is a big deal on the HyperNet hacker boards. He's quite well known among the community. Every once in a while, one of them sends a message, but no one has tried to make contact in person. How do you suppose she found us? Ayeka looked concerned, and Marcus supposed it was a little stalkerish. We all checked in under our real names. I don't imagine it would be hard for a hacker to locate us. I just wonder how she got here. Most of them are broke. Solomon ran his fingers through his still damp hair, then dragged a fresh shirt over his head. He sat on the edge of his too-soft bed, mind running a mile a minute. Why was he doing this? He hated talking to people. Sure, it was flattering when they sent him private messages complimenting his code or asking for help with some program or other. But hunting him down and asking to meet in person was a whole other thing. The Queen of Hacks was one of his steadiest fans, sending a message every few weeks. He wasn't certain if that made it better or worse. He got up and paced, walking from the bathroom door to the TV and back, 10 paces from one end of his room to the other, shaking his head and muttering, his flip-flops smacking the bottoms of his feet as he alternated between trying to talk himself into and out of going through with the meeting. Solomon sat back down. Many more trips and he'd need another shower, air conditioning or not. Solomon slapped his knee. Marcus was right. If they didn't get along, he'd leave and never have to see her again. Breathing a little easier now that he'd decided, Solomon grabbed his data slate, swiped over to her message, and replied that he'd meet her in an hour in the hotel bar. If she made it, great. If not, well, he wouldn't deny that might be a relief. The hotel bar was situated a little to the right of the stone and steel entryway. Solomon sat facing the door at a table made of dark wood and sipped a scotch. He grimaced, not sure why he ordered the nasty stuff. Marcus loved it, but he could hardly choke it down. Two wrinkled, gray-skinned bipeds in gray tunics from a species he didn't recognize rested on stools at the bar sipping bubbly green drinks. They were the only other patrons this early in the day, and that suited Solomon fine. The fewer people that saw him make a fool of himself, the better. He checked his watch. 5 minutes to showtime. 3 minutes later, the door swung open and a human woman with a medium build, long dark hair and chunky, dark-framed glasses entered. She clutched a large brown purse to her chest and peered around the bar as though unable to see well in the dim light. She took a step and wobbled on her 3-inch heels. Solomon was certain she was about to fall, but she caught herself. She looked just a little less comfortable than he felt. This had to be his date. He stood up and waved. She smiled, flashing bright white teeth, and walked with all the grace of a 2-year-old over to his table. Solomon pulled out the second chair so she could sit before she fell over. You must be the Queen of Hacks. I'm Solomon. I know. It's so killer to meet you. I'm a huge fan of your work. That randomly mutating tracking program you wrote a few years ago was genius. My name's Emily. She held out her hand, complete with midnight blue lacquered nails, and Solomon gave it a hesitant shake. So how did you find me anyway? Pure dumb luck. She waved the waiter over. He nodded and started towards their table. I won a week-long vacation to this planet, and when I got here, I hacked some guest registries on a whim. You know, just to see if anyone I knew was here. Imagine my surprise when I saw your name. I just had to take a chance to see if you'd meet me. That sounded like bullshit to Solomon, but he decided not to call her on it. If she was telling the truth, he'd be embarrassed, and if she wasn't, he'd find out on his own later. The waiter arrived and asked, What can I get you? I'll have a Martian ale and the glitter duck salad, Emily said. The waiter turned to Solomon. For you, sir. Solomon frowned as he thought. I'll have the swine burger, chips, and a lemonade. The waiter nodded as he jotted the order down. When he finished, he took his leave and Solomon was on his own again. He had no idea what they should talk about. This was exactly why he hated dealing with people, but lucky for him, Emily seemed eager to keep the conversation going. "What about you? This place doesn't seem like your scene." She had him there. "Most of it isn't, but have you seen the virtual arcade yet? They have everything in there." "Cool. I'll check it out tomorrow. I'm more impressed you could swing the fee. Even a junk room here costs 1,000 credits a day, and that doesn't include food or entertainment." Solomon coughed, uncertain how much he should tell her about his work for the council. "I sort of won my vacation, too. It's a bonus from my last job." She nodded, seeming impressed. "That must have been a hell of a job." He nodded back, remembering how many times he almost died. A hell of a job barely covered it. It was. The waiter arrived with their food, sparing him the need to elaborate. Marcus yawned and glanced at the clock on the wall of his room. 4 in the afternoon local time. The bed squeaked when he flopped back on it. He'd expected to hear from Solomon long before now. His date must be going better than Marcus expected. He grinned. If it went past 15 minutes, it would be better than he expected. "What are you thinking about?" Ayeka came out of their bathroom, long black hair dripping, a short green silk robe tied around her waist. All thoughts of his friend vanished. "I don't even remember." He crooked his finger, beckoning her over to the bed. Ayeka walked toward him, slow and sinuous, teasing him as she loosened the tie on her robe. She made it halfway over and had the tie almost undone when someone knocked on the door. Marcus's grin turned sour. It was a good thing for whoever was out there that he'd left his blasters on the ship. He bounced off the bed and trudged to the door. Through the external camera, he saw Solomon dancing in place, a big smile on his face. He sighed, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Solomon barged through, spun in a little circle, and stopped facing Marcus. If he broke into song, best friend or not, Marcus was going to punch him. "I take it your date went well?" "Better than that. She's smart, funny, pretty, and she gets my programmer jokes." "Well, there had to be someone in the galaxy that got them. I'm glad you had a good time. Was there anything else?" "I never talked with anyone as long as I did with her. Not even you. We're going to the arcade tomorrow. Isn't that great?" "Wonderful." Marcus ground his teeth. "It's fantastic, Solomon," Ayeka said. "Don't pay any attention to him." Solomon turned toward Ayeka when she spoke, and his jaw dropped when he saw her lying on the bed in her little robe. Marcus understood his reaction perfectly. "Did I interrupt something?" Marcus patted him on the shoulder and guided him toward the door. "If anyone ever says you're not a genius, I'll tell them about your powers of observation. Good night, Solomon." He slammed the door, locked it, and turned back to Ayeka, whose robe now lay in a green pile beside the bed. His grin returned. Solomon retreated to his room, leaving Marcus and Ayeka to their own devices. He settled in the lumpy chair beside the cheap metal table in the corner of his room and connected his data slate to the hypernet. It didn't take long to pull up Emily's biography and do a simple background check. He felt a little guilty doing it. He really liked her, and it seemed like a breach of trust to snoop on her like this. On the other hand, he'd gotten shot at enough times over the last year that he'd picked up a little of Marcus's mistrust. And like her or not, he wasn't stupid enough to take her word for everything. She was born on Earth, which surprised him a little. He'd have sworn she was a colony girl. Graduated at the top of her class at Caltech, a few brushes with Earth Force for illegally accessing some secure servers. Couldn't have been anything too serious since she wasn't in prison or dead. He frowned. Unless she made a deal with them. Maybe Emily agreed to spy on him for Earth Force. Solomon chuckled at his own self-importance. After what the Void did, Earth Force had way more pressing things to worry about than him. More likely she tried to make her college loans disappear. He swiped to the next screen. Her family life looked pretty solid, even boring. Totally different than him and Marcus. Her parents were alive, still married, and gainfully employed for a robotics manufacturer. Talk about boring. No wonder she struck out for space. He switched the slate off and tossed it on the table. He'd seen enough. His instincts said she was a good person, and that was enough for him. He yawned. This world had 28-hour days, so by Earth Standard Time it was close to bedtime. He flopped down on the bed, eager for morning and his second date with Emily. Chapter 2. You were right. That place was great. Emily pulled Solomon along by the hand, through the doors and out of the arcade. She wore a black sundress and, thank the universe, sneakers. They'd just finished a marathon 4-hour gaming session. Emily held her own in all his favorite games, which impressed Solomon a great deal. They stopped in a little park, not much more than a patch of grass with a couple of benches, across from the arcade. "Where do you want to go for lunch?" she asked. Solomon shrugged. He hadn't gotten around to trying any of the many restaurants at the resort. He usually ate room service at the hotel. "Wherever you want is fine." "I read about a place that's supposed to serve Vensar delicacies." Solomon shot her a pointed look. Was she hinting around for him to say something about Dracor? If she noticed his reaction, she gave no sign. "I don't know how anyone would know for sure since no one has ever visited their homeworld." "That's fine. It'll probably be something healthy since they have to fight their disease." She frowned. "I hadn't thought about that. I'm on vacation. I don't want something healthy." She kissed him, just a quick peck, but right on the lips. He stared at her, a stupid grin on his face. She was the first girl not related to him he'd ever kissed. Should he say something? He probably should. Before he could, Emily went on. "How about that Earth-style diner? I'd kill for some onion rings." "Sure, onion rings." That might not have been the best thing to say, but she smiled, so he figured it wasn't bad. The diner was a garish thing of chrome and neon. A giant flashing sign over the top said, "Ma's Diner." Solomon shook his head. Who had researched this place? He doubted there had been a restaurant like this on Earth in centuries. If the food matched the decor, he feared for his stomach. "Are you sure you want to eat here?" "Yeah. I saw a place like this in a museum back home when I was a little girl. It was the neatest thing. I never imagined I'd get to eat at a real, operating diner one day. Come on, let's go in." Solomon held the glass door open for her, then followed her in. On one side of the long, narrow restaurant sat 10 booths, and on the other a counter lined with stools. Everything that wasn't chrome someone had painted a horrid, bright orange. Looking at the dining area made his head hurt. Worse, he didn't see a single human among the dozen customers. That alone argued they should go somewhere else. A 3-eyed female behind the counter wearing a blue and white dress with an apron in front waved at them. "Sit anywhere you like." "Thanks." Emily grabbed his hand and dragged him to the nearest empty booth, not giving him a chance to voice his concerns. He realized if she held his hand, he'd go anywhere with her. Whether that was a good thing, he hadn't decided. It certainly felt like a good thing. The waitress sauntered over and handed them a pair of honest-to-God laminated menus. Solomon shook his head. How retro could you get? She turned her disconcerting triple gaze on him. "Start you with a drink, hon?" "Ooh, I'll have a chocolate shake," Emily said. Solomon nodded. "Me too." "Coming right up." "Isn't this awesome?" Emily looked almost giddy. Solomon didn't want to crap on her excitement, but he couldn't help but ask, "Where do you suppose they get the milk?" Emily shrugged. "I imagine a big farm somewhere on this planet with thousands of happy cows. What do you think?" "I think that sounds way better than my idea." "What about food?" "Cheeseburger and onion rings. You?" "That sounds good. Rough day for the happy cows." She smiled and laughed, a high, musical sound that set Solomon's heart racing. He feared he might be falling in love. The food arrived, and they ate in amiable silence. When they finished, Emily leaned back and sighed. "Awesome!" Solomon nodded, relieved the meal had turned out well. He left a 20-credit coin on the table and led the way out. When they'd moved a little ways away, he said, "So what do you want to do now?" Emily sighed. "I've got to call my parents and run a few errands. How about we meet for breakfast tomorrow?" "That sounds good. Where do you want to meet?" "I hear good things about the restaurant at your hotel. 9 o'clock Earth Standard Time sound good to you?" He nodded, perfectly willing to agree to anything she suggested. Emily leaned in and kissed him. Not a quick peck this time, but a long, lingering kiss that took his breath away. When she finally broke free, he stared at her, another big, stupid grin on his face. She smiled. "See you in the morning." He nodded. Maybe he really was falling in love. Solomon tossed and turned all night, too excited to sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about seeing Emily in the morning. He felt giddy, out of control, and he loved it. He knew Marcus would laugh at him, but he didn't care. Solomon hadn't been this happy in ever. When it was almost time to meet Emily, he rushed down to the hotel restaurant to wait. In the lobby stood a 15-foot-tall fountain in the shape of a naked woman of uncertain species, carved of glittering crystal. Water shot out of her raised hand and cascaded down her body to splash into the pool at her feet. Half a dozen benches carved of the same crystal sat around the pool, so people could rest and enjoy the fountain. Emily waited on one of the benches, her legs tucked up under her blue sundress. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting," Solomon said. She smiled, though it looked a little sad. "I got here early. I was eager to see you again." "You should have called my room. I've been up for hours. Truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about you." She didn't reply. "Is everything all right?" She gave a little shiver, then nodded and smiled. "Fine. Come on, I'm starving." The hotel restaurant waited a few steps from the fountain. The automatic doors hissed open as they approached. Inside, the dining room had 40 tables covered with crisp, white linens and polished silverware that sparkled in the light from a bank of windows overlooking the pool. They were late enough that only 3 tables had parties and the staff had free time to stand around chatting near the kitchen door. Solomon recognized a 4-armed waiter as being the same species as the counselor that tried to betray them to the void. A different waiter, a reptilian male with rough brown scales and a short tail, noticed them and came over. "2 for breakfast?" Solomon nodded, and Emily said, "Something by the window." The waiter motioned them to follow him and led them to an empty table overlooking the pool. Even at this hour, people splashed and walked around. Was Marcus out there yet? He doubted it. Marcus and Ayeka seldom rolled out of bed before noon. Solomon and Emily ordered drinks, and the waiter left to fetch them. "What's on your mind?" Emily asked. Solomon smiled. "I was thinking my friend is missing a beautiful day." "What's he doing?" Solomon's cheeks burned when he thought about what Marcus was probably doing. "He's sleeping in." The waiter approached, their drinks balanced on a small tray, saving him from having to elaborate. He set Solomon's orange juice in front of him. A moment later, the doors exploded in, showering them with safety glass. Solomon spun around in time to see 6 men in black body armor carrying heavy blasters rush through the shattered door. They wore masks and goggles, so he had no idea what species they were. The other patrons screamed, and a couple got out of their chairs. One soldier fired a rapid burst over their heads, blowing chunks out of the ceiling tile. "Everyone on the floor, now!" The lead invader turned his way and rushed towards their table. "Not you two." "Hey, what's going on here?" A thickly built near-human with dark hair and wearing a grease-spattered apron emerged from the kitchen, interrupting the masked man. One of the others spun and blasted a hole through his chest big enough for a fist to pass through. That was just a guess on Solomon's part based on his build, spun back to face them. He held his blaster rock steady after shooting the unfortunate cook. These men must be hardened killers if they could shoot a complete stranger without a twitch. "You two are coming with us." The man Solomon considered the leader motioned with the barrel of his blaster. "Get up." Solomon scrambled to his feet, racking his brain, trying to figure out who these people were and what they wanted with him. He came up blank. He and Marcus had made plenty of enemies over the years, and this gang might work for any of them. Emily grabbed his arm. "I'm scared." One of the others pointed his blaster at her head. "Shut up and move." Solomon raised his hands over his head and looked at the floor, trying his best to appear non-threatening. He almost laughed. He wasn't a threat to one man without a blaster, to say nothing of 6 with them. Emily followed his lead and put her hands up. The strangers hustled them out the shattered doors and through the lobby. It was silent save for their feet on the tile and the tinkle of the fountain. No one tried to stop the masked men, which was bad for Solomon and Emily, but good for everyone else. At the base of the short flight of steps leading up to the hotel, an unmarked, gray hover van waited. Two of their captors ran ahead and opened the back doors. When they reached the back of the van, the leader said, "Stop." Someone grabbed his arms and yanked them behind his back, wrenching his shoulder and drawing a wince. Restraints of some sort. Solomon guessed stun cuffs, snapped around his wrists. Emily squeaked in pain when they repeated the procedure with her. One of the kidnappers shoved him in the back and he stumbled into the van. A moment later, Emily landed on top of him. The van's engine roared as they rushed off. Pounding on the door dragged Marcus out of a delightful post-sex haze. Ayeka groaned beside him. "Tell them to go away. You read my mind." He tossed aside the warm, heavy blanket, grabbed a robe from the back of the comfort form chair next to the bed, and shrugged it on. Barefoot and annoyed, he shuffled over to the door. Marcus flipped on the security vid and found a human male in a blue and black uniform standing outside. He frowned. In his experience, nothing good ever came from a person in uniform waking you up. Even if it was, he glanced at the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock. He opened the door more curious than alarmed. "What can I do for you, officer?" "Marcus Drake?" the security officer asked. No matter the planet, every security man he'd ever encountered spoke in that same dull voice. Did they receive training, or did it come naturally? "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" "You could call it that." The officer pulled a data pad out of his pocket and studied it for a moment. "This morning, a little after 9, 6 men blasted their way into the hotel and kidnapped 2 human guests. One, Solomon Keyes, listed as a member of your party, and an Emily Smart, not registered at this hotel." Marcus's mind raced. Someone had kidnapped Solomon and his girlfriend. He ran through a list of potential suspects and found it a long one. Who had they been after? Solomon or the girl? "Mr. Drake?" The officer cocked his head and stared at him. "I said we have security camera footage if you'd like to take a look." "Yeah, sure. Let me get dressed and I'll meet you downstairs. And call me Marcus, Officer Smith." The security man raised his hands and smiled. I know, and believe it or not, my first name is John. I'll meet you at the elevators." Marcus nodded and closed the door. Maybe Smith wouldn't turn out to be too big an asshole. He turned and found Ayeka out of bed and searching for her clothes. "You heard?" "Yeah." She wrestled on a snug pair of black slacks. "Void, you think?" Marcus shook his head and tossed his robe on the bed. "I doubt it. If black, masked men with weapons for arms showed up and started disintegrating people, Smith would have mentioned it. Besides, whoever took Solomon wants him alive. I can't imagine why the Void would spare him." Ayeka finished getting dressed a minute ahead of him. "Earth Force?" Marcus secured the last button of his favorite blue shirt, then pulled on heavy black boots. Somehow he doubted this would turn out to be a flip-flop kind of day. He dearly wished for his control gauntlet and a couple blasters. "Earth Force has more pressing problems than kidnapping. Besides, if not for Solomon, they'd have ended up in worse shape than they're in now. I'm afraid we're dealing with something unrelated to the Void invasion of Earth." Marcus held the door for her, and they walked together down the unremarkable beige hall toward the elevators. "If that's true," Ayeka said, "it'll make it a lot harder to figure out who's responsible." They reached the shiny metal elevator doors, and Marcus hit the call button. "It certainly will, but it won't stop me from finding them. And when I do, they'll regret hurting my friend." The elevator chimed and the doors slid open. Smith stood with his back to them, hands in his pockets. Down past the statue fountain, more individuals in uniforms worked, taking 3D images, scanning for DNA, and generally processing the scene. "Officer Smith?" He turned at the sound of Marcus's voice. Captain Drake, forgive me for not using your proper title upstairs. Miss Kazumi, a pleasure to meet you. This way, please." They followed him away from the crime scene and through a plain, unmarked door. They entered the security office. Dozens of video screens covered the wall. A slim, twitchy alien with 10 eyes across his forehead stared at Marcus, unblinking. A long tongue shot out and licked the eyes before snaking back into his mouth. Marcus suppressed a shudder. He'd seen worse over the course of his travels. "Chief Vix, Would you play the recording for us? Officer Smith asked. The alien didn't speak, just turned around and typed commands into his console. All but one screen went blank, plunging the room into near-total darkness. On the active screen, Solomon sat beside a girl near the fountain. She was kind of cute in a computer geek sort of way. There was no sound while they talked, and soon they left the bench and went toward the restaurant. The viewpoint shifted, and they were inside sitting at a table talking some more. A second monitor came to life. On it, a gray van pulled up outside the hotel, and 6 men in combat armor and masks piled out, heavy blasters in their hands. All around them, people went running. The kidnappers blasted the restaurant door to smithereens, no doubt hoping to intimidate the patrons into behaving. They moved through the wreckage 2 by 2, one group covering the next while the last group watched the lobby. Whoever they were, they knew their business. After they shot the cook, they took Solomon and the girl out to the van, put stun cuffs on them, and threw them in the back. The van sped off a moment later. The video stopped and the other monitors came to life, brightening the room back up. Any thoughts? Smith asked. They're pros, that's for sure, Marcus said. It looked like they came specifically for Solomon and the girl. They could have been any of a dozen species under that armor. I don't know what to make of it. Does this happen often here? Smith shook his head. I've been working here 10 years and nothing like this has ever happened. We don't have much of a criminal element here. All the vice stuff is legal, so there isn't much for the syndicates to do for income. We have a few murders every year, lovers' quarrels, that sort of thing. Some theft, of course. But this? Professional thugs blasting their way into a luxury hotel and kidnapping a guest? No, nothing of the sort. Marcus frowned and tapped his chin. Just because there's little illegal for criminals to make money with here doesn't mean they aren't here. Plenty of legit businesses have friends in low places. That's where I'd start looking. Smith's frown matched Marcus's. If I go poking around where you suggest, I'll be out of a job in a hurry. I did a little digging about you two before I came up to your suite. You've been mixed up in some crazy stuff. Is there any way I can convince you to help me out with this? Kinda quiet-like? I can provide you access and whatever official cover you need. Marcus had no intention of letting Smith handle this on his own, so when the officer suggested bringing him in officially, he said, Sounds like a good idea. We'd be glad to help. Chapter 3. So what do you want to do first? Smith asked. He seemed eager to get going, and Marcus suspected the powers that be didn't like the sort of publicity 2 of their guests getting kidnapped brought down. I'll need screen captures of those masked men so I can send them to my contacts. I assume you're tracking the van? Smith shook his head. We have little hope for that. It's either stolen and they'll dump it somewhere, or they'll plasma bomb it so nothing's left. Do you have satellites for tracking? Ayeka asked. No, just the weather control units. Management discovered people don't like getting tracked on vacation. When they ditched the security satellites, bookings went up 40%. I'll bet. Cheating husbands on business trips and criminals making illicit deals most likely. Do you know where the girl was staying? Smith consulted his datapad. A small hotel called the Glittering Star. It's one of the lower-end establishments about 2 miles north. I sent a unit to check it out. When I hear something, I'll let you know. The tin-eyed alien held out a data chip. Screen captures. It spoke with the sibilant, drawn-out S at the beginning and end of the sentence. Marcus pocketed the chip and nodded his thanks. It seemed they'd done about all they could here. Exchanged contact information with Smith, then he and Ayeka headed out. Security officers blocked the front entrance, so they went out the back and swung around to a little cul-de-sac where the security people had sent the taxis that arrived that morning, looking to pick up fares. Marcus flagged down a yellow taxi. Even out here they painted them yellow, to take them the 20 miles to the spaceport. He climbed in beside Ayeka and slammed the door. The taxi sped away, and Ayeka asked, What now? If you're willing, I'd like you to dig up as much as you can on Solomon's girlfriend. I'll contact Vlad and send him the pictures. If he doesn't know who the heavy hitters on this planet are, he'll know who to ask. I'll do what I can, but I assumed Solomon would have checked up on Emily as soon as he met her. If he found nothing, what are the chances I will? Excellent. You know how well men's brains work when a woman's involved. Solomon probably did a cursory background check, found nothing incriminating and left it at that. He didn't want to find anything bad about her, so he didn't. Ayeka shook her head. I see your trust issues remain unresolved. They reached the spaceport in time to see a massive star cruiser, easily 20 times the size of the star, take off. Marcus paid the driver, a blue-skinned near-human with a bionic left eye, who took off in search of his next fare. The drop-off point was right in front of a 5-story terminal made of shining steel and darkened glass. Thousands of tourists from dozens of species came and went, lugging their suitcases behind them on anti-gravity sleds. Out on a landing field, a second huge commercial transport capable of carrying over 1,000 individuals hovered near the loading bays. Marcus and Ayeka hurried away from the crowded terminal and toward the private hangars. The Star waited in Bay 47. The hangar resembled a giant pipe someone cut in half and hammered into the ground before adding doors on either end. Simple and ugly compared to the terminal, but secure, even more so since Gruesome was on guard duty. Marcus typed his 6-digit access code in and the hangar doors slid open. His beautiful ship, a fresh coat of gray paint on her smooth hull, rested on hydraulic landing gear. The cargo bay doors sealed tight. No one had tried to get in. Voice recognition activate, Marcus Drake. The computer hummed and a moment later beeped. Open cargo bay doors. After a clunk and creak, the hydraulics activated and the doors opened. Ayeka glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. I thought you got the ship fixed up. I did. Everything works perfect. She's just a little stiff after sitting for a while. The door thudded on the concrete and Marcus led the way up. At the top, a pair of red lights flared to life 10 feet off the floor. Hi, Gruesome. I'm back. The warbot's eyes flashed from red to green when it recognized Marcus's voice. Ayeka flipped the light switch, revealing Gruesome in all his frightening glory. Marcus grinned at the robot. Shiny black enamel covered Gruesome from top to bottom, and protrusions as sharp as knives covered its shoulders, shins, and forearms. The warbot made his old load handler look as harmless as a puppy. The cargo door clanked shut. If you're done ogling that robot, we've got work to do. Marcus patted Gruesome's leg and led the way to the cockpit. The hold was empty of cargo, and his footsteps echoed in the hollow space. It seemed wrong not to have something in the hold. The door slid open without a sound as they approached the corridor. He glanced back at Ayeka and nodded toward the doorway. She smiled and shook her head. So you've got one door that doesn't squeak, screech, or clank. Congratulations. Thanks. They passed the doors to the galley and living quarters, then climbed the short flight of steps up to the cockpit. The cockpit door hissed as it slid open, prompting a shrug from Marcus. One door out of 3 wasn't so bad. He stepped into the cockpit and sighed. Home again. The scent of leather and oil washed over him as he sat in the pilot's chair, settling into the familiar dents forged from years of sitting. Ayeka sat beside him in Solomon's chair. It felt a little strange looking to his right and seeing her there. Marcus clenched his jaw and fired up the comm unit. He'd get Solomon back, one way or another. This is a surprise, Marcus. Vlad's familiar face, with its white hair, deep wrinkles, piercing blue eyes, and ever-present cigarette filled the monitor. I didn't expect to hear from you until you finished your vacation. I am finished with my vacation, though not by choice. Marcus filled him in on Solomon's kidnapping. I thought you might know who I should talk to. I'm sending you some images captured on the hotel security cameras. There's not much to go on, but I hoped you might recognize something I missed. Vlad frowned, took out a cigarette and flicked off the ashes. I don't recognize them or the gear. Everything looks pretty generic. There's only one person out there that can help you, though if she's involved it'll be risky. They've got Solomon, and I've got nothing to go on. If your contact can help, I'll take my chances. Who is it? Her name is Madame Margaret. She runs a strip club/whorehouse called the Hungry Kitty. Perfectly legal and above board. She also runs all the illegal and legitimate businesses on the planet for the 9 dragons. She's a powerful woman, Marcus. Best mind your manners. When have I ever been less than a gentleman? I didn't think the dragons cooperated on joint ventures, much less all 9 clans together. They don't. Vlad stubbed out a cigarette and lit another. Pleasure Planet 4 is a special case. They set it up as a safe haven. somewhere the clans can get together to relax and discuss business. They've all sworn to keep the peace, and you know how they are about keeping their word." Marcus licked his lips as he thought. If this is a safe place for them, the last thing they'd want is to draw attention. Seems like whoever grabbed Solomon must have done it without their permission. They might appreciate me dealing with the interlopers. Vlad nodded. "That occurred to me as well. It's the main reason I'm sending you to Madame Margaret. When you get to the club, ask for her and tell the security team the Silver Fox sent you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The Silver Fox? What can I tell you? Is the nickname they gave me when I made peace with the Black Dragons. Good luck, my boy. If I can do anything else, just ask." "Thanks, old man." Marcus disconnected. Well, he had somewhere to start now. If he had to search, a strip club wasn't the worst place to go. He turned to Ayeka. "Did you find anything?" "Not much." She looked up from the monitor. "Far as I can tell, she is who she claims to be. Maybe she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Marcus shook his head. He didn't trust coincidences, but it was possible. A quick search turned up the address of the Hungry Kitty, about 300 miles east in the next resort. He looked for a landing field and found one on the outskirts of the resort. Nothing elaborate like the spaceport, just a small facility that catered to people with their own ships. 2 minutes into his pre-flight check, his comm beeped. He tapped the flashing red light on the console. "Officer Smith, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "Please, call me John. I wanted to tell you my men found nothing unusual at Ms. Smart's hotel. She made no calls with the hotel comm, and the staff says she was a model guest. Never gave them a bit of trouble, and no visitors. I hope you're having better luck." "Too soon to say, but we're heading east to check out a lead. I'll touch base tomorrow if it pans out." Marcus disconnected and resumed his pre-flight check. Maybe Ayeka was right, and the girl was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then why take her at all? "You know I'm coming with you, right?" Ayeka stood, hands on hips, staring at Marcus while he disconnected the straps that held his hoverbike in place at the rear of the hold. "There's no way you're going to a strip club on your own." Pained, Marcus looked up at her. "You don't trust me?" "To not cheat on me? Yes. To keep your temper under control and not get yourself killed if they don't tell you what you want to know? Not so much." Marcus worked the last strap free and powered up the bike. If he remembered right, she was the one that punched the Earth Force director in the face the first time they met, and she worried about his temper? At least she trusted him not to fool around on her. Not that he could imagine a woman beautiful enough to tempt him. "I appreciate your concern, but I've been dealing with people like this since I was a teenager. I grew up around crooks, remember?" Ayeka frowned. "These people are dangerous, and you don't take them seriously enough." He stood up and took her hands. He loved that she worried. "I take them very seriously. One person is less of a threat than two. Plus, if they know Vlad, then they know a little about me. I'm from their world, even if I'm out of it now. You, on the other hand, come from Earth Force. You can see how that fact might make them nervous." "I guess. You want me to wait here?" "Please. I'll be fine, and if I'm not, you can come rescue me." Marcus swung a leg over the bike seat and sat down. "I shouldn't be long. Keep the ship sealed, and if anyone gives you trouble, fire up gruesome." He tapped a button on the bike's control panel and the rear doors lowered. Ayeka leaned down and kissed him. "Be careful." He grinned and gunned the engine. The bike shot out the hold onto the tarmac. The little field wasn't all that impressive, nothing but a flat paved area with landing zones marked off with blinking lights. Off to his right, a blue and white garage with 3 large bays waited to assist visitors with any mechanical troubles. A tanker truck parked beside it. Marcus turned left onto a short road that connected the landing area with the main highway to the resort. 5 minutes on his souped-up bike, and Marcus pulled off the highway into the crowded city traffic. He wove his way through the less nimble cars and trucks, occasionally getting an annoyed honk for his efforts. The ship's computer automatically downloaded the club's location into his computer, and 15 minutes after leaving his ship, Marcus came to a stop in a space in front of a black and chrome 3-story building. In the air above it danced a 20-foot-tall hologram of a topless female sporting fantastic proportions and black cat ears jutting up from her head. Classy. This place would fit right in on New Vegas. He powered the bike down and activated the anti-theft devices. It looked like a nice neighborhood. Brick buildings 3 stories tall with shops or restaurants on the bottom and apartments above. It was still mid-afternoon, so he doubted anyone would bother his ride, but he also didn't want to walk back to the airstrip, so why take chances? Leaving his bike, Marcus climbed a short flight of stairs to a set of closed double doors. A sign said open at 8. He sighed, not wanting to wait until 8. A rap on the door brought a bald, beetle-browed near-human with enough muscle to wrestle a gort. The man scowled at him. "Can't you read? We're closed. Come back at 8. He slammed the door in Marcus's face. He knocked again. When the ugly man opened the door, Marcus said, "I'm here to see Madame Margaret." "What makes you think the boss wants to see you?" "Just tell her the Silver Fox sent me. She'll understand." The unfortunate bouncer's brow crinkled even more, probably debating whether to toss Marcus to the curb or go ask his boss. "Wait here." The door slammed again. Marcus sighed, relieved the bouncer asked first. Now he just had to hope Vlad's introduction would get him through the door. Chapter 4. Solomon couldn't see a thing in the back of the dark van, and it stank of sweat and oil. Beside him, Emily shifted, trying to get comfortable on the bare metal floor. Solomon leaned against her so she'd know he was still there, that she wasn't alone. She leaned back and he sighed. A little ways away, the kidnapper's armor creaked when they moved. How could they see anything in the back of the van? Then he remembered their goggles. They must have a thermal mode. He considered and rejected trying to talk to them. These people didn't seem big on conversation, and he wasn't charming enough to talk his way out of anything. Solomon took deep breaths and tried not to panic. He'd gotten kidnapped before, so he had experience at this sort of thing. What had he done last time? Right, he got beat up, then Marcus rescued him. That wasn't especially helpful. He assumed by now someone had told Marcus they'd kidnapped him, which meant his friend would be looking for him. Solomon let out a second, slow sigh. Marcus would find him, and when he did, these people would be sorry. His revenge fantasies came to an abrupt halt at the same time the van did. A moment later, the rear doors opened and light blinded him. Rough hands grabbed his ankles and dragged him out. He landed with a grunt in the dirt. "Get up!" A hand grabbed his collar and yanked him to his feet. A little squeak indicated Emily got the same treatment. He stifled the urge to fight them. It would accomplish nothing beyond getting him slapped around, or worse. One of the kidnappers shoved him, and he stumbled forward, blinking, trying to clear the spots out of his vision. They pushed him towards a trailer. He blinked again. It was a 50-foot-long freight hauler hovering by the side of the road. The kidnappers must be worried about someone spotting their van. Probably the hotel had surveillance cameras. They must not have a hacker working for them capable of shutting the system down. Solomon almost stopped in his tracks. Maybe that's why the kidnappers grabbed them. They needed a hacker for some job they had planned. One of the masked men poked him in the back with his blaster barrel. "Move." At the rear of the trailer, the double doors stood open, and a short step ladder waited to help them up into the box. Inside, Solomon counted 4 pallets piled just short of the ceiling. The lead kidnapper gestured towards the stepladder with his blaster, and Solomon needed no further instruction. He climbed up the ladder and got in the trailer without killing himself, despite having his hands cuffed behind his back. From somewhere deeper in the trailer came a cool breath of air. They must have installed a cooling system to keep them from overheating. Emily came up next, then 4 of the masked men. 2 of the kidnappers held blasters on them, while the other 2 positioned the pallets at the rear of the truck to block the view of anyone inspecting the cargo. The kidnappers, still outside, closed the doors, locking them in the dark again. One of the kidnappers said, "If either of you makes a sound, you're dead." The hauler lurched forward, and they were on their way again. Solomon didn't know how long they drove before the hauler finally stopped, but he really had to pee. The doors opened, once again dazzling him and blasting him with hot, humid air. The thrum of heavy equipment reached him, and a moment later something removed one of the pallets. It only took a few minutes for them to remove all four, by which time Solomon could see again. Their captors in the trailer motioned them toward the doors, and Solomon hastened to obey. At the rear of the trailer, an empty pallet held up by an anti-gravity forklift waited. Standing beside the forklift was a man in his mid-40s, fit, and wearing military fatigues. He held his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for them. The newcomer didn't have a mask, and Solomon wasn't certain if that reassured him or worried him. But something about the guy sent his danger meter into the red. One of the masked men poked him in the back, forcing Solomon onto the pallet. Emily joined him, and a couple seconds later they stood on the ground. A quick look around revealed the kidnappers had brought them to a clearing carved out of the jungle. The only sign of civilization was the rough dirt road that brought them to the clearing, and a large building covered in camouflage netting. The new man approached, a neutral, disinterested expression on his face. Small wrinkles surrounded dark, deep-set eyes. The wrinkles, combined with brown, leathery skin, spoke of a man that spent a lot of time outside.
I'm sure you're curious why you're here. But that's my concern, not yours.
His voice had a harsh rasp, like someone who'd breathed in a lot of smoke. Solomon's eyes widened. That's why the new man made him so nervous. He reminded Solomon of Vlad. He had the same air of control the Mars crime boss exuded.
I'll make this simple for you. You do what we say when we say, and you won't get hurt. Cause me or my men any trouble and, well, use your imagination. I need you alive with your hands and arms functional. That's all.
The stranger jerked his head toward the building.
Let's get the hell out of this heat.
They walked together toward the building, Solomon sandwiched between the head kidnapper and Emily. Behind them the armed men followed, blasters leveled at their backs. Sweat drenched Solomon when they finally reached the cool, shadowed interior of the building. There was nothing terribly impressive inside the shelter. 8 cots, a desk with a portable computer, a pair of racks to hold their weapons. At the very back was a door with a deadbolt. Their cell, he suspected. The leader led them to the cell door, undid the bolt, and motioned them inside. The guy wasn't much of a conversationalist. Solomon went in first with Emily right behind. Their captor followed them in and removed their cuffs before leaving and slamming the door shut. The bolt slid home, trapping them in the little cell. Solomon sighed. Home sweet home. They had 2 cots, 2 chairs, and a small folding table. In the back they'd set up a privacy screen. Solomon sent a silent prayer to the universe and looked behind it. Bingo, a small chemical toilet. Solomon emerged from behind the screen feeling much relieved. He barely moved out of the way before Emily raced to take his place. He shook his head. Some gentleman. It never crossed his mind to see if she wanted to go first. Solomon sat on a cot, and a few minutes later she emerged from behind the screen. You okay? He asked. She nodded and sat beside him. What are they going to do with us? Solomon shrugged. He simply had no idea. Whatever they want. They seem to need us in one piece. My best guess is there's a system they want hacked. Why else kidnap a pair of hackers? They certainly didn't take me hoping to get money. What about you? My family isn't rich. I doubt they could raise more than a few thousand credits on short notice. So it's a job. We do the job, then they let us go. Hopefully. Hopefully? Her voice raised a notch. I'd be more confident if the leader had worn a mask. We know what he looks like now, so that's a bad sign. She whimpered and pressed tighter against him. Solomon put his arm around her in a rough imitation of offering comfort. He should have kept that last observation to himself. In the little windowless room, time meant nothing. They sat, they dozed, and generally tried to keep from going insane. Solomon's stomach growled, and he wished they'd kidnapped him after breakfast. After the universe knew how long the bolt slid open, Solomon sat up and swung his legs over the side of the cot. He glanced at Emily. It looked like she was asleep, but he wasn't sure. The door opened, and the leader stepped through the doorway.
Get up.
Solomon hopped to his feet. Emily groaned and rolled off her cot. She didn't look too steady when she got to her feet. Her nap must have left her fuzzy-headed. He hoped she'd snap out of it soon.
Turn around.
Solomon did as he said. He wanted to go and steady Emily, but didn't dare. A second later, 2 thugs came in, jerked his hands behind his back, and replaced the cuffs. The procedure was then repeated with Emily. Once they were secure, a kidnapper grabbed his arm and led him through the shelter and out into the clearing. Dim sunlight created long shadows of the jungle trees. It wouldn't be long before dark. In the clearing sat a sleek, black and white starship about half the size of the star. It looked fast and sported a pair of heavy, forward-facing blaster cannons under the cockpit. It could probably put up a good fight if it came down to it. He frowned. The side of the ship said planetary security along with the serial number. Did they have a friend on the inside, or did they steal a patrol craft? The rear cargo bay door opened and a figure in a security uniform walked down the ramp. He wore a helmet with an opaque eye shield covering half his face. From what Solomon could see, he looked human, or close enough. Everything about the ship and pilot looked legit, which led him to believe the pilot was a corrupt security officer. "Is this the cargo?" The pilot gestured at Solomon and Emily. The boss kidnapper nodded. "You have the coordinates?" The pilot nodded. "I'm meeting them at—" "I don't need to know. My part of the deal is done. The sooner they're gone, the better. Load 'em up." 2 of the masked kidnappers shoved them up the ramp into the ship. Unlike the Star, this ship had a small hold dominated by 6 cells used to restrain individual prisoners during transport. His guard shoved Solomon into the first cell on the right and Emily into the second. He pushed a button on a control panel built into a pillar in the center of the hold, and the cell door slid shut and the lock snapped into place. Solomon sighed. He'd hoped they might remove the cuffs. Having his arms behind his back made his shoulders ache. He was getting sick and tired of being locked up somewhere new every few hours. Hopefully this would be a short trip. "Where are they taking us now?" Emily asked. He wished she wouldn't ask him things like that, as though he had some idea what these people had in store for them. He didn't, and he sucked at offering strong, comforting words. Solomon was so far out of his depth at this point he feared he might never surface. "I don't know, Emily. I just don't." The pilot came up the ramp a few seconds later, and the doors closed behind him. He walked past the cells, paying his prisoners no more heed than Solomon did the cargo he and Marcus hauled. 2 minutes later, a vibration ran through the hull when the engines fired up. The ship lurched, and they took off. Solomon chewed his lip. How would Marcus find them if this stupid ship took them to the other side of the planet? They flew for a while, then the vibration from the engines went down to a dull hum. They must be close to wherever they were going. They hadn't flown for more than 10 minutes, so most likely they were still on the same continent, though the artificial gravity and acceleration compensators made it impossible for him to tell which direction they traveled. After a brief pause, the engines powered back up. So much for that theory. A deeper, more powerful thrum filled the hold. "Solomon, what's that?" Emily's anxiety clawed at him. He focused on the sound, and his heart sank. "It's the hyperdrive." How would Marcus ever find them now? Chapter 5. Marcus sat on the railing outside the strip club and waited. Above him, the hologram buzzed as the image shifted. He had no idea how far the bouncer had to go to find his boss or what she was doing. Maybe they'd just make him wait until 8. That was one way to enforce their rules. He sighed and forced down his impatience. The bouncer had only left 5 minutes ago. He couldn't expect instant access, even using Vlad's name. There were rules dictating this sort of thing. The 9 Dragons had rules for everything. They had to. Otherwise, they would have murdered each other by now. That would have been a shame. 10 more minutes passed before the lock clicked. He hopped off the railing and the door opened. Instead of the bouncer, a ruby-skinned female Etherian stood on the other side of the door. Etherians were a race regarded by pretty much every other race as the most physically flawless, and this one was a typical example. Long platinum hair hung down to her waist, framing a heart-shaped face. Smooth, silky skin, colored a pale pink, was covered by the absolute minimum amount of clothes, all of them sheer and leaving nothing to the imagination. Marcus couldn't hold in a grin. It was a good thing Ayeka hadn't come with him. She might have beaten him to a pulp. If she could have read his mind, she would have done worse than that. You're certainly an improvement over the old doorman. She smiled a flawless, pearly smile, revealing a pair of elongated eye teeth. Madame Margaret insisted you receive every courtesy. After your meeting, I'd be delighted to entertain you in private. No charge. Marcus swallowed, and the sweat that beaded up on the back of his neck had nothing to do with the heat. An Etherean prostitute probably cost 10,000 credits an hour. That's very generous. But I'm spoken for. Her smile broadened. I know. Congratulations. You've proven yourself an honorable man and have passed the first test. Lucky for you, we only count actions, not thoughts. Follow me. She winked, turned, revealing a backside every bit as flawless as the front, and led him into the club. That's a good policy. Otherwise you'd have to kill every man that laid eyes on you. She laughed, warm and bright. It made him want to make her laugh some more. Stop thinking about her. To distract himself from his guide, Marcus turned his attention to the clubs. There was a polished wood stage with 4 brass poles for the girls. A bunch of tables of various sizes sat empty in the well-lit room. He figured it would be a lot darker in there at night. Opposite the stage was a bar behind which rested row upon row of bottles, intoxicants for the various beings that visited the club. At the rear of the club was a staircase. One set of stairs led up and a second down. His guide went up and Marcus hesitated, not sure how close he should follow to avoid getting an up-close view of things he shouldn't be looking at. She noticed his reluctance and laughed again. Don't be uncomfortable. I've had hundreds of men staring at me wearing less than this. Your gaze doesn't offend me. In fact, I find it charming that you worry about a whore's feelings. You're a person like any other, Marcus said. What you do for a living shouldn't affect how people treat you. I've seen enough people judged by their line of work to not want to do it myself. She stepped back off the step and placed a hand on his chest. Your lady is lucky to have you. Why don't you lead the way? We are going to the 3rd floor. Relieved, Marcus climbed the steps. At the 2nd floor landing, a door blocked his path deeper into the building. From behind it, he heard faint, feminine giggles. He turned up the next flight of stairs, and behind him his guide said, That's where the girls get ready and later entertain their guests. Marcus assumed as much and didn't comment. At the 3rd floor landing, she resumed the lead, brushing against him as she moved to the front. Somehow Marcus found the willpower not to react. The sparkle in her eye when she looked back at him said she knew just how much it cost him. Was she testing him again, or just playing? He didn't dare ask. She pushed the door open and led the way down a corridor paneled in dark hardwood. Erotic paintings hung every 10 or so feet, and spaced between them were closed doors, each numbered with a bronze plate. The corridor ended at yet another door, exactly like every other one he'd seen. His guide knocked, and the door swung open. She smiled, and his heart melted a little. This is where I leave you. Best of luck. Before she could leave, he asked, What's your name? Mina. It was good to meet you, Marcus Drake. If things don't work out with your lady friend, look me up. She walked back down the hall, and he couldn't help watching the play of her muscles under her meager costume. He loved Ayeka. He loved Ayeka. Marcus tore his gaze away from Mina and entered the office. The only lights in the room were directly over a large steel desk with a single chair in front of it and a figure shrouded in loose, black garments behind it. It didn't take a genius to recognize the invitation. Marcus focused straight ahead, trying not to imagine how many blasters lurked in the darkness. He reached the desk, and a slim, feminine hand emerged from the folds of cloth to point at the chair. Marcus bowed and sat. You know something of our ways, Captain Drake. She spoke in a husky voice not much above a whisper. He smiled. Enough, I hope, not to give offense. Thank you for seeing me. Of course. Always a pleasure to see one of the Silver Fox's associates. May I offer you a drink? Thank you. That would be nice. Seconds later, so fast he had to be standing in the dark waiting, a human of Asian descent in a black suit stepped into the light, a tumbler full of whiskey on a silver tray. He offered it to Marcus, who took the glass, nodded his thanks, and sipped the amber liquid. He held it on his tongue, savoring the smoky burn, before swallowing. That's some good whiskey. He couldn't see the woman's face, but felt certain she smiled. Good. Now to business. How can the 9 dragons help you? You heard about the kidnapping this morning? Yes. Bad for business. We're doing our best to keep it quiet. So it wasn't your people who took Solomon and his girlfriend? Marcus's hopes rose. If the dragons didn't do it, maybe they'd help him. Of course not. We don't do that sort of thing here. This planet is our sanctuary. Whoever did this did it without our permission. The cold tone she used made Marcus glad he had done nothing without her permission. It doesn't sound like you know who's behind it. She leaned forward into the light, and Marcus got his first good look at her. Black, shoulder-length hair framed a classically beautiful Asian face. Almond eyes, full lips, small chin. The only flaw he saw were some fine lines around her eyes. She could have been Ayeka's mother. Somehow that made him feel better. I can't give you a name, but I can give you a location. My people tracked their ship's unannounced arrival 3 days ago. Marcus frowned, and she nodded. Yes, the same day you arrived. Not a coincidence, I think. They're mercenaries, not a group we've used or even dealt with. Also, not a coincidence. Whoever sent them for your friend knew what they were doing. Marcus nodded, mind working, trying to figure which of his enemies had the money and connections to pull this off. The list shrank a little, but it was still way too long. Right now it didn't matter who was behind it. They could figure that out after he rescued Solomon. You wouldn't object to me talking to the mercenaries? They both knew what he meant when he said talk. Not at all. In fact, it saves us the trouble of having to talk to them ourselves. When you're finished, I expect they'll never talk to anyone else again. Clear? Crystal. I'm working with a security officer named Smith. Should I tell him about this before or after? She leaned back into the shadows, and he caught snatches of whispered conversation. She leaned forward again. Smith is one of ours. Tell him whatever you like. We'll instruct him to provide whatever help you need. The man with the silver tray stepped out of the shadows again. This time he had a data chip on his tray. Marcus got up, took the chip, and bowed again. Thank you for this. She nodded. Deal with the mercenaries, and we will call it even. Behind him, the door opened. As dismissals went, that one was pretty clear. Marcus backed a few paces away from the desk, then turned and walked toward the rectangle of light. He stepped out into the hall, and the door shut behind him. A little ways away, leaning against the wall, waited Mina. Marcus smiled. Waiting to see if I made it out in one piece? She stepped away from the wall and moved to walk beside him, a little closer than he was comfortable with. As they headed toward the stairwell, she said, You wouldn't have been the first person to go in and not come back out. I'm pleased you're intact. He laughed. Me too. Thanks for worrying. They retraced their path to the front door, no further conversation passing between them. Marcus stepped out onto the front landing. The sun sat low in the sky, tinting the sky orange. He turned to face her. Take care of yourself, Mina. She flashed an eye tooth. Actually, it's Margaret. She closed the door, leaving him staring at the blank steel door. Marcus tightened the final strap around his bike. He hardly remembered the ride back to the landing field. Margaret's last words stunned him. He knew the dragons had non-human members, but to have one running a planet-spanning operation? He'd say this for her. She was one hell of an actress. Ayeka entered the hold from the cockpit. She stopped by the door, crossed her arms and frowned. Looked like she was still mad at him for not taking her along. He left the bike and went to join her. "Well, you're alive," Ayeka said. "That's something. How'd it go?" Marcus told her what happened, leaving nothing out but glossing over a few details, most related to Margaret's costume. When he finished, Ayeka said, "The Nine Dragons' leader is an Etherian?" Ayeka's incredulity matched Marcus's. "I know. It surprised me too. That's probably the best thing she's got going for her. No one would expect her to be in charge. The thing that matters most is I know where to find Solomon. Let's contact Smith and head out." Marcus started toward the cockpit. Ayeka grabbed his shoulder. "Did you really pass on a chance to hook up with an Etherian for me?" Marcus grinned. "I told you. You're the only woman for me." She kissed him, and they continued on towards the cockpit. "Was she as hot as they claim?" Marcus glanced over his shoulder. "Do you think I'm stupid enough to answer that?" She laughed. The cockpit door hissed open at their approach. Marcus dropped into his chair and punched a comm number into his console. It took a few seconds, but Smith finally answered. "Marcus, word is you have some good news." "Hopefully. Did our mutual friend fill you in on everything?" "Everything I needed to know. There won't be any patrols in the area until you call me. When it's done, we'll handle the cleanup." "Sounds good. We're heading out now." Marcus powered up the star and slipped the data chip into the reader. All that came up on his screen were a set of coordinates. Ayeka typed them into the navigation system, and a guide appeared on his heads-up display. Looked like they were only half an hour out. Anxious as he was to find Solomon, he wanted to get there after dark. It would make their stealth system even more effective. He did a quick search. Sunset was an hour away. No problem. He'd just fly slow. They blasted off from the landing field, and Marcus set a course that would take them on a long loop out wide from the target. He kept his speed under Mach 1, and when they flew far enough away from civilization, activated the cloaking device. He grinned. The mercenaries would never know what hit them. When the sun finally set, Marcus swung the ship towards the coordinates Margaret provided. He came in slow and silent, using the anti-gravity generator and maneuvering jets to position the star directly above a clearing in the jungle. On his scanners, little figures loaded gear into a hauler. It looked like they planned to move again soon. He turned to Ayeka. "I'll go down with Gruesome. You stay here and watch the scanners. If anyone tries to escape, blast them." "Be careful. These people look like professionals." "Don't worry. After everything we've been through, I don't intend to buy it on some jungle pleasure planet." She smiled. "We really don't have very good luck with jungle planets, do we?" "I don't know. If not for a certain jungle planet, I might never have met you. Still, next vacation I vote for a water world." "I second that." She squeezed his leg. "Good luck." "Thanks." He left the cockpit, relieved Ayeka hadn't insisted on coming down with him. He doubted she'd approve of what he'd agreed to do for the dragons. He reached the hold and walked over to Gruesome. "Wake up." The warbot's photoreceptors flashed green, then glowed steady, indicating it was ready. War mode. The light went from green to red. Blunt fingers designed to handle cargo lengthened into rending talons. Banks of micro-missile launchers slid out of concealed compartments in its shoulders and lower legs. A pair of heavy blasters emerged from forearm slots, followed by the plasma cannon in its chest. "War mode confirmed." Gruesome's voice was so deep it vibrated in his chest. "We need 3 prisoners for questioning. There are potentially 2 non-combatants, so watch your field of fire. Lethal force is authorized." The crimson lights in Gruesome's eyes flashed once. "Acknowledged." Marcus went over to the storage cylinder where his armor waited and typed in his access code. The cylinder spun around, revealing the gleaming black armor. He and Gruesome should make quite an entrance. "Black Dragon, armor up." Chapter 6. Marcus clanked over to the rear door control panel. He always felt a little awkward when he first put the armor on, and hit the switch. The doors squeaked open, revealing the clear night sky. Below them, the lights of the mercenaries' camp revealed the clearing and their continuing work. Marcus used eye movements to control the suit's heads-up display and activated the dedicated link to Gruesome. Commence attack. The warbot walked to the end of the loading ramp, every step rattling the deck, and leapt into the darkness. 3/4 of the way to the ground, thrusters built into its feet and backfired. It looked like someone set up a flare. A couple seconds later, crimson streaks of killing energy streaked up from the ground. Gruesome responded in kind, and the battle began. Marcus leapt out of the ship, fired his thrusters, and flew around the battlefield. Gruesome would handle the heavy combat while he scouted around and checked out the building. If Solomon was anywhere, it would be there. He scouted around the clearing, checking for hidden snipers or traps. The building, a temporary shelter similar to what soldiers used on long-term deployments, had only one entrance and no guards. An explosion rocked the clearing. Either Gruesome had gotten serious or the mercenaries had more firepower than he thought. The scream of blaster fire continued without slowing, so whatever blew up, it hadn't ended the fight. He landed by the open front door and scanned the interior. No life signs, but they might have a shielded room. He charged the vortex cannons in his gauntlets and ran through. The building was empty. The mercenaries must have loaded everything into the hauler already. At the back of the shelter was a door leading to a windowless room. That had to be the holding cell. Marcus jogged over as fast as his armor would allow. Halfway there, his comm buzzed. "Marcus, the hauler is trying to escape. What should I do?" "Are there any life signs?" A short pause as she checked the scanner. "Just the driver. Target the cab just in case the trailer is shielded." The suit's audio enhancers picked up the thump of the Star's heavy cannons, followed an instant later by an explosion. Sounded like Ayeka got him. Putting that out of his mind, he focused on the cell door. When he got closer, he found it shut tight and the bolt open. He clenched his teeth and fought down a wave of irritation. No one could be inside. Just to be sure, he ripped the door off its hinges, not because he needed to, but to let off some steam, and glanced inside. Nothing. Like the rest of the shelter, they'd moved everything out. He turned to leave, then stopped. Marcus focused his scanners on the floor and zoomed in. He barely made out a few scuff marks. From the pattern, it looked like 2 cots sat side by side. They were here at some point not long ago. Good. Now he needed to find whoever led this bunch and ask him where to find Solomon. Marcus turned away from the cell and headed toward the door. Outside, the blasters had fallen silent, and all he picked up were faint moans and the thump of Gruesome's tread as he walked around. He stepped outside and scanned the area. The hauler burned at the edge of the clearing. 4 bodies lay unmoving on the ground, and Gruesome stomped back and forth in front of a trio of men in combat fatigues who tried their best to stay away from the heavily armed robot. Some of the exterior lights had gotten blasted in the fight, leaving the prisoners in shadow. "Ayeka, do you read?" "Go ahead. Turn on the floodlights, please." The Star's powerful floodlights lit up the clearing. "Did you find Solomon?" "I'm still working on it. Would you contact Smith and tell him we've dealt with the kidnappers?" "No problem. Do you want me to come down?" "No, it's a mess down here. Nothing you need to see." Marcus switched off his comm and walked over to the prisoners. He crouched so his faceplate was level with them. "Where's the couple you kidnapped?" None of them spoke. One mercenary, a scarred man with a shaved head, spat at Marcus's feet. He sighed. He hadn't thought this would go easy, but it would have made for a nice change of pace. "If you don't talk to me, you'll talk to that." Marcus jerked a thumb toward Gruesome. "And it won't ask you nicely." They didn't so much as flinch. Did they think he wouldn't follow through? "Gruesome, interrogation mode. Start with this one." He pointed at the mercenary that spit at him. Gruesome stomped over, reached down, and grabbed the bald man by the leg. The mercenary shouted and kicked at the indifferent steel hand. The warbot lifted the unfortunate man so his head was even with Marcus's chest. Then it clamped on to the flailing leg so he couldn't struggle anymore. "Last chance. Do you want to talk, or do you want Gruesome to make a wish?" Dead silence. Marcus shrugged like he didn't care, but inside he hated what he had to do next. "Pull." Maybe an example would get the other 2 in the proper mood. The motors in Gruesom's arms whirred to life and the robot pulled the mercenary's legs in opposite directions. Marcus had to give the guy credit. He didn't make a sound until he was at a full split. Another 6 inches had him groaning. Marcus held up a hand and the warbot stopped. "Where's my friend?" "Go to hell." He shook his head. "Idiot." Marcus dragged a finger across his throat and Gruesome ripped the man's legs off. Blood gushed, and half a minute later the mercenary had bled out. Gruesome tossed the body aside. Disgusted but determined, Marcus bent down beside the remaining mercenaries. "How about you two? I believe I've demonstrated my seriousness. If you don't tell me what I want to know, I'll have my robot rip your arms off. As you've seen, he won't have any trouble doing it." The younger of the two, a man in his early 20s with close-cropped blonde hair and a patchy beard, trembled. The older man glared at him, and he went still. He must have gone through some serious training if one look was enough to stiffen his spine after watching his comrade get killed. Perhaps watching Gruesome rip his commander's head off would get him talking. Marcus pointed at the older man, and Gruesome bent down to grab him. "Stop!" the young mercenary said. "We handed him over to a crooked security officer a few hours ago. His job was to take your friends to our employer. I swear, I don't know who or where. Even the commander didn't." "I believe you." Marcus switched over to his direct line to Gruesome. "Finish them quick." The warbot blasted both men so fast they never made a sound. Marcus grimaced under his faceplate. He hated doing shit like that, but he had made a deal with the dragons, and if he'd gone back on it, well, the less said about that, the better. Leaving the murdered men where they lay, he went over to the hauler. The mercenary that tried to flee hadn't even bothered to secure the back doors. Marcus flew up into the back of the trailer and switched on his chest light. The trailer was 3/4 full with cots, trunks, folding tables, and a computer. He grabbed the computer, flew up to the ship, and sent Gruesome the recall command. A few seconds later, the warbot landed in the empty hold, all his lethal surprises hidden away again. His outer chassis had a few burn marks from the rocket that hit him, but other than that, Gruesome came through without a scratch. Marcus closed the loading ramp, set the computer down, and returned his armor to its cylinder. When he backed out of the storage cylinder, a thin sheen of sweat covered him. The suit hadn't overheated him, but killing those 3 men had. Jobs like that were why he didn't work for Vlad anymore. He hoped this would be the last killing he had to do before he rescued Solomon, but somehow he doubted it. He took the computer to the cockpit where Ayeka waited. She sat cross-legged in the co-pilot's chair, staring at the door when he walked in. "Did you have to kill them?" Shit, she'd been watching on the scanners. "I made a deal with the dragons. I agreed to deal with the mercenaries in exchange for their location. It was the only way they'd help me. We got here too late. They handed Solomon and his girlfriend over to a security officer a few hours ago." "So all this was for nothing?" Marcus set the computer down on his console, then dropped into his chair. "No, Smith should be able to find out where the ship went, then we can go track them down." "Sounds simple." Ayeka's smile held a sad note. She'd never seen his ruthless side. He'd done his best to leave that part of his life behind, but it would always be there, like a hidden blade, ready to cut anyone that threatened those he cared about. "Smith said he'd be out at first light." Marcus nodded, so exhausted in that moment he wanted nothing more than to hit his bunk and sleep. Maybe he'd wake up and this would all be a dream. Definitely not a dream. The stink of the bodies rotting in the early morning heat, combined with the buzz of insects, confirmed it for Marcus. He wished he still had on his armor with its sealed environment. He'd landed the Star in the clearing when Smith's transport arrived 20 minutes ago. Ayeka offered to remain on the ship, much to Marcus's relief. She really didn't need to see or smell this mess up close. The security officer had walked around the clearing, a grimace of distaste on his face. The two of them stood a little ways away from the charred remains of the hauler. 6 of Smith's men went through the debris and collected bodies for disposal. "So you didn't arrive in time. I'm sorry." Smith shook his head. "Doesn't look like they'll be bothering any of our other guests. The bosses will appreciate that. They kept their end, and I kept mine. No more, no less. The mercenaries I interrogated said they handed Solomon and Emily over to a security officer. Any thoughts who that might be? Not a clue, but the central computer tracks all ship movement planet-wide. It'll be simple to see which ship was here last evening and where it went. Come on. Smith picked his way through the charred clearing over to a boxy blue transport sitting a few feet from the star. The loading ramp was down, and they walked in past a pair of acceleration couches where the officers sat during flight. A few feet past the couches waited a computer terminal. Smith pulled a keyboard out of a slot under the screen and typed in an access code. The screen flickered and came to life. Smith tapped the screen and swiped back and forth until he reached the screen he wanted. It showed a map of the area covered with blinking dots. He honed in on their current location and typed in a time code. The image ran for a few seconds until a blip stopped in their location. "That's your man, Arnold Cade," Smith said. Marcus frowned. Why didn't he disable his transponder? He had to know you could track him. Good question. The transponder is integrated into the control system. It would take an expert to disable it without rendering the whole system useless. But if they had this planned for a while, he could have found someone. Let's see where he goes. Smith typed a command and the image moved again. The blip didn't move very far, but the map got smaller underneath it. Does that mean what I think it means? Marcus asked. If you think it means he went into orbit, then yes, it does. The blip vanished off the screen. And that means he entered hyperspace. Well, now I know why he didn't disable his transponder. He never plans on coming back, and we have no authority outside this system. Shit! He could be anywhere. It's not as bad as all that, Smith said. He punched in another command. Those prisoner transports have a fairly short range. Based on his last heading and given his limited range, there's only a couple places he could reach before he needed to refuel. The computer beeped and a list of 3 planets popped up. There you go. He's most likely headed to one of those planets. He typed a couple more commands and a small strip of paper emerged from a slot below the screen. Smith tore it off and handed it to Marcus. I included his exact transponder signal so you could scan for it. All right, thanks. Can you get me a printout of the pilot's face so I'll know him when I see him? No sweat. In fact, I should have thought of that myself. Smith punched in another code and a larger sheet of paper slid out with an image of the officer. It almost looked like a mugshot. He had short brown hair, brown eyes, and a square jaw. Nothing that would make him easy to spot in a crowd. Marcus accepted the second printout. Do you need anything else from me? Not a thing, Captain, and thank you again. Oh, if you should capture the officer intact, please return him for trial. We can't let someone get away with betraying his office like that. Marcus raised an eyebrow. In his experience, the dragons didn't bother much with trials. Perhaps trial isn't the right word. We would like a chance to deal with him. Marcus nodded. No promises, but I'll do my best. They shook hands, and Marcus left Smith to his cleaning up. He walked the short ways back to the ship, trying his best to ignore the sights and smells of the battlefield. A moment before he set foot on the loading ramp, a whoosh caught his attention. Marcus turned back to see one of the officers blasting the pile of bodies with a flamethrower. He shuddered, ran up the ramp and closed it behind him before the stink of scorched flesh reached him. Ayeka sat in the cockpit waiting for him. She wore a simple black jumpsuit, and for half a second he mourned the loss of her red bikini. Oh well, it wouldn't be practical where they were going. Did you get anything good? She asked. Marcus handed her the list. Their best guesses given the pilot's last known course. She read the list. What are the chances he's actually on one of these planets? Lousy, unless he's an idiot. I bet he made a short jump beyond their scanner range, adjusted course, and then went to meet his boss. I'll need to call in a favor if we want to find this guy before something happens to Solomon. Chapter 7. The transport ship rattled as the engines powered down. Solomon blinked sleep from his eyes. Somehow, in the dark, uncomfortable cell, he dozed off. His mouth tasted like cotton. None of his captors had seen fit to offer him a drink. Hydraulics squeaked as the loading ramp lowered, and light from outside the hold made him squint. Where were they? He hadn't noticed the shaking that accompanied an atmospheric re-entry. Solomon? Emily groaned a little in her cell. Where are we? The officer stomped down from the cockpit, cutting off his reply. He walked past them without so much as a second look. The muscles in his jaws bunched, and he wore a fierce scowl. Their captor of the moment clanked down the ramp, and a moment later a smooth, unfamiliar voice said, "Everything went smoothly, Mr. Cade?"
"Yeah, no problem. Where are my credits?"
$500,000, as agreed. Silence, as Solomon assumed. The security officer looked over his payment.
"All right. Want me to fetch them down?"
"Please." Their captor stomped back up the ramp and walked over to the pillar with the control panel. He hit something. Solomon couldn't make out the panel from his cell, and both doors slid open. The officer looked around the pillar.
"Out! Both of you!"
Solomon stepped out of his cell, and a moment later Emily joined him. She looked unsteady, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. He wanted to reach out, offer her some reassurance, but with his hands cuffed behind his back, all he could do was meet her gaze and smile. Kind of pathetic under the circumstances. The officer jerked his head toward the ramp.
"Go on!"
Solomon made his way down the ramp, careful not to lose his balance. Beside him, Emily did the same. When he reached the bottom, a familiar face waited for him, an old, wrinkled man with a long face and white chin whiskers. Foot-long spiral horns jutted from his brow, and he wore a fine, blue silk robe. "You! Did you go to all this trouble just to get back at us?" The horned man brayed a harsh, deep laugh. Solomon tried to remember his name. He hadn't seen the old guy in 3 years, and then only for a few minutes. "You and your friend's interference with my marriage was a minor setback, nothing more. No, you're here because I have need of your particular skills. Any discomfort it might cause you and the good captain is just a pleasant bonus." "What's Emily got to do with this?" "Emily is here to assure your compliance. If you cause me any difficulties, she will pay the price. Keep that in mind should you get any foolish thoughts. Now follow me." The horned man, Dorne something, Solomon finally remembered, turned away from the ship and walked off. Now that he'd recovered from the shock of seeing the old man again, Solomon looked around at their temporary home. They'd landed in a large hangar. A pair of black two-seat fighters, cannons under the cockpits and missiles under their wings, sat on the far side of the hangar. At the opposite end, a wide opening loomed with nothing separating them from the vacuum of space except an invisible force field. Emily screamed, and Solomon turned toward her. "What is it?" "When I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it." Dorne held a small remote in one clawed hand. "Now follow me." Emily gasped and sagged, a trickle of smoke coming from her stun cuffs. Dorne walked off again, and this time Solomon and Emily hastened to keep up. One way or another, he'd make Dorne pay for hurting Emily. An automatic door slid open at their approach, and they left the hangar behind. Solomon just caught the roar of the transport's engines powering up before the door closed behind them. Beyond the doors, they entered a plain, steel hallway that branched to the left and right. Nothing indicated another soul lived in the place, wherever it was, but he couldn't imagine Dorne living without servants and other comforts. They passed 3 metal doors before the old man stopped and gestured them inside the 4th. Solomon entered at once, and automatic lights flicked to life. The room was stark in its lack of decoration. Unadorned walls, smooth steel floor and ceiling, all painted a neutral gray. 2 cots sat against one wall, and a desk with a computer sat next to the opposite wall. A second door, he assumed, led to a bathroom. All in all, it was a good room to commit suicide in. Dorne removed a collar from a hidden pocket in his robes and snapped it around Emily's neck. "Turn around." Solomon did, and a moment later the cuffs came off. His shoulders screamed when he moved his hands around to the front for the first time, and he knew not how many hours. Dorne removed Emily's cuffs and backed away toward the door. "Rest. Food will be brought for you shortly. I need you at your best for what I require. You will begin in 10 hours. "What?" Dorne stepped out the door, and it snapped shut. "Do you want me to do?" "Guess you'll tell me later." Emily sat on the edge of the cot nearest the door, and Solomon sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. "Are you okay?" She nodded. The stun cuffs hurt, but only when the current runs through them. What are we going to do? How do you know that awful man? Solomon frowned. Where to begin? Marcus and I did a job a few years ago. There was this girl, a little younger than you. On her world, she was a princess, rich family, you get the idea. Somehow this guy, Dorne, arranged with the girl's family to marry her off-world, then claim her money. Well, she got wind of it and somehow got in touch with Marcus. She hired us to smuggle her back to her home planet. It was a near thing, but we managed it. The rulers of her planet, Tricella Prime, didn't appreciate what almost happened to their princess, so now Dorne and everyone else involved all have prices on their heads in the Tricella system. Add to that the fact that he missed out on getting his claws on about 20 million credits, and, well, here we are. How many enemies have you made? She sounded more curious than afraid. Maybe everything that had happened left her overwhelmed. I never counted them, but plenty, I guess. In our line of work, the only way to avoid making enemies is to kill everyone on the opposite side of your deal. That's hardly practical and may lead to angry family members hunting you instead. Solomon sounded pretty cool, but the truth was when he thought about everyone they'd pissed off over the years, it scared him half to death. Emily looked into his eyes. Will you do what he wants? Her voice trembled. He squeezed her shoulders and tried to sound reassuring. If I can, I promise I'll protect you from him. Solomon almost laughed at that. He couldn't even protect himself. Solomon sighed. 2 adequate meals and a decent night's sleep had done wonders for his outlook, if not his situation. Now, if he could find a way to get Emily's collar off, learn to fly a fighter, and sneak out of this prison, he'd be all set. Emily rested on her cot after picking at her meal. She didn't seem to be handling their situation well, and he worried about her. The door slid open and his mood soured. Dorne walked in like he owned the place, which he probably did, and motioned toward the computer terminal. Solomon hurried over and sat at the table. He tried it earlier and found the system dead. Dorne flipped a switch and the computer booted up. Now it's time for you to get to work. I need you to hack into the Galactic Council's system and insert spyware for me. Solomon's mouth dropped. This was why Dorne chose him. He'd helped Drakor design the new system to make it impossible to hack. The old man must have thought he had a back door into the system. I can't. The system is designed so that only a terminal hardwired into the system can access the critical functions. Dorne waved off his concern. I'm aware. The systems I want access to aren't critical to the Council. What I want is access to the interior cameras, specifically the ones in the Council chambers. Solomon shook his head, not understanding. Why would you want to watch Council meetings? I sat through a couple and almost fell asleep. Dorne frowned, wrinkles deepening with his displeasure. Why is not your concern. You will get me access to those cameras or... Dorne pulled out the remote and pointed at the still dozing Emily. All right. It's still a heavily encrypted system. I can't just snap my fingers and get you in. Dorne put the remote away. For both your sakes, you'd best get the job done quickly. You should have everything you need. If not, let me know. I'll be checking your progress from time to time. I'll start right now. Dorne nodded and turned toward the door. When the door closed behind him, Solomon let himself relax. Writing the program wouldn't take much effort, but he needed to draw the process out as long as possible to give Marcus a chance to find them. Whatever Dorne led them to believe, Solomon doubted he'd just let the 2 of them go. Emily sat up on her cot. Can you do it? She sounded so desperate. I think so. She rolled out of her cot and came over to stand behind him. Solomon called up the main menu. Basic interface, coding program, secure hypernet connection. Minimal, but enough to work with. He started typing. Half an hour later, he had a crude messaging program. He input the star's comm ID and a call for help. When he hit send, the screen flashed invalid address. Looks like you can only access certain external comms. Emily leaned forward and breathed on his neck, her chest pressed against his back. Solomon's face burned and he got up. This isn't going to work. I can't concentrate with you so close. At least not on this. Emily looked around the Spartan cell. There's nothing else to do. Besides, it's awesome to watch you work in real time. I've only seen your finished code, never a work in progress. He scratched behind his ear. Why don't you drag a cot over and have a seat? Leaning over me will not work. She smiled, the first one since they got captured. Cool. Marcus wanted to pull his hair out. A full day had passed since the security officer, Cade, took Solomon off planet. He'd called Drakor as soon as they cleared the system and asked him to put out a council alert on the prison transport. The Vensar counselor had been happy to help. He'd struck up an odd sort of friendship with Solomon and was almost as eager as Marcus to get him back. Marcus had expected results much faster. He sat in the cockpit and tried not to think about all the bad things that might be happening to Solomon. Almost as bad as his concern for his friend, since he questioned, then killed the mercenaries. Ayeka had become distant, even moving back into her old room. He'd lost his friend, and in the process of trying to get him back may have driven away his girlfriend. He almost hoped the security officer didn't want to tell him where Solomon was so he'd have an excuse to beat it out of him. Damn it! He couldn't think that way or he'd never get Ayeka back. The comm sounded, jolting him out of his gloomy musing. He checked the readout. It was Drakor. Hopes high, Marcus hit the flashing button and the familiar silver mask appeared on the screen. Please tell me you have good news. I do. We got a hit on your transponder. A string of numbers appeared on the screen. Marcus checked the coordinates and frowned. The system was outside the projected range for the transport by half a light year. Are you sure that's him? I'm sure it's the correct code, and the person that contacted me saw a ship matching your description land at his hangar. Beyond that, I have nothing. That's gotta be him. Thanks, Drakor. Any time, Marcus. If you require further assistance, please let me know. The first counselor disconnected. Marcus typed the coordinates into the navicomputer. He smiled a sad little smile. How long had it been since he'd handled his own navigation? When the computer indicated it had the course plotted, he activated the hyperdrive and shot into the vortex. The cockpit door slid open and Ayeka entered. Marcus turned and grinned. She stood with her arms crossed and didn't look at him. His grin withered. Drakor called. He got a lead on the transport. Ayeka nodded and sat in the chair opposite him. I figured. What's wrong? Marcus couldn't stand it anymore. If she hated him and wanted nothing more to do with him, he wanted to find out now. I'm sorry about what happened with the mercenaries. She finally looked at him, her eyes red from crying. It's not just that. This whole business just drove home the fact that we'll never have an ordinary life. We can't even go on vacation without something crazy happening. Marcus stared at her, uncomprehending. I'm an ex-smuggler and current agent of the Council. An ordinary life was never in the cards. I don't want an ordinary life. I need the rush, the excitement. This is the life I love, and I love having you in it. I've never been happier than I have been since we met. She shook her head. Since we met, I've almost gotten poisoned, blasted, disintegrated, burned to a crisp, irradiated, and shot into space. After I cleared my name, I intended to settle down to a quiet life of study on Alpha. But stuff keeps happening. I understand. He almost choked on the words. After we get Solomon back, I'll take you to Alpha. I'll miss you. But the truth is, I wouldn't last a month doing anything ordinary. And I don't think I can stand much more excitement. Chapter 8. The Rogue Star emerged from hyperspace a safe distance from Randon Prime, a heavily developed industrial planet. In the view screen, the planet seethed with clouds, most of which, according to his research, consisted of pollution from the thousands of factories churning out products 24/7. The little patches of land and water visible through the black clouds looked brown and ruined. There were no star cruisers or defense satellites in orbit, and no one hailed them as they flew closer. The government probably figured no one would want to attack their dingy little planet, Of all the places for Cade to lie low, why this toilet? Is the atmosphere even breathable? Ayeka leaned forward in her chair for a closer look. Since their talk, the two of them had settled into an uneasy company. He still loved her, more than he could say. But after what she said about an ordinary life, he realized they wanted different things. Much as he wanted to be with her, he couldn't see himself living the life she wanted. The visitor's guide says visitors from other worlds are advised to wear filters over their breathing orifices. Their words, not mine. I'm not sure what bothers me more, that they feel the need to point out their gray air isn't healthy, or that they have a visitor's guide in the first place. Marcus's joke didn't get so much as a smile. He sighed and aimed the ship at the planet. He called up the coordinates of the landing field Drakor mentioned, circled the planet until they faced the proper landmass, and descended. The star rattled when she hit the atmosphere, and though he couldn't see it, Marcus suspected they kicked up more than the usual flames as they streaked through the filthy atmosphere. They passed through the clouds and pollution and found their course took them toward a large city. Even from a distance, the place looked like a hole. Tall, corroded towers jutted up hundreds of stories, and all around them factories, some of them 50 blocks long, belched black smog into the air. On the edge of the city, he spotted the flare of a ship's engines as it took off. Marcus guided the ship that way, and in short order, they hovered near a rundown collection of rusty hangars, about half of them occupied by an equally rundown collection of ships. Near the center of the hangars, an office or control tower or something a little less rotten than the rest of the buildings sat like the single surviving tooth in a tabak chewer's mouth. He waited for someone to hail them, but after a couple minutes gave up and slid into one of the empty hangars. He powered down the engines and turned to Ayeka. I'll go talk to the owner. I've got an extra mask if you want to come. She favored him with a half-hearted smile. I think I'll pass. He nodded, not surprised, but disappointed all the same. The pollution wouldn't do her flawless complexion any good anyway. Marcus left the cockpit and headed for the hold. Halfway there, he stopped at a storage locker and retrieved his control gauntlet. He felt better the moment he strapped it on. In the hold, he went over to a wall-mounted bin and popped the lid. Inside, a jumble of tools, spare parts, and other junk waited. He pawed them aside, looking for his breathing mask. One of these days he'd have to make a real effort to get these bins as organized as his weapons locker. At last he found a mask. Gray and grease-smudged, it looked like he hadn't used it in months. Probably not since the last time he cleaned the ventilation system. The filter looked good, though, so he strapped it on, opened the door, and headed out, sealing the ship behind him. Marcus left his ship and headed toward the only non-hangar on the property. Lights burned behind the grimy windows, so someone was home. He rapped on the door, then pushed it open. Inside, behind a desk piled high with some sort of overly thick paper, sat a man with rough, leathery skin devoid of body hair. He squinted at Marcus, put his hands on the desk. His arms, corded with muscle, pushed off and stood up, revealing a massive, broad-shouldered body wearing simple brown clothes made of a stiff, durable material Marcus didn't recognize. He doubted a shot from his stunner would even make the man flinch.
You that new guy in Hangar 20?
The owner had a thick, scratchy voice that matched his appearance perfectly. Marcus removed his mask and let it dangle around his neck. That's right, I'm Marcus Drake, and I work for the Galactic Council. I believe you spoke to my boss earlier today. He nodded his massive bald head.
Right. Your man's in Hangar 32. Paid for a week in advance. Ain't seen him since.
Thanks. Mind if I poke around?
Knock yourself out.
The owner sat back down behind his wall of paper and lost all interest in Marcus. Given his total lack of motivation, why had he bothered to report Cade's arrival? Marcus left his amiable host to his work and set out to track down Hangar 32. He found it about as far as you could get from the office and still remain on the property. The lack of a hangar door made Marcus's job easy. He slipped inside, just as slick as you please. The security transport sat on its gear, sealed tight. He went to the rear of the ship and checked for an access panel, but found nothing. Arnold must have had a remote access key like his gauntlet. Well, shit. His hopes for a quick in-and-out dashed, Marcus returned to his ship. He still had a few options, several of them expensive and none of them a sure thing. A command from his gauntlet opened the loading ramp. Marcus entered the hold, jogged up to the cockpit and found it empty. He sighed and shook his head. It reminded him of the old days when he worked alone, running Vlad's errands. He didn't miss the old days. He missed Solomon. He missed Ayeka even more. She was just down the hall, but felt light years away. Marcus set his dark thoughts to one side. He'd make things right later. For now, he needed to find Cade. First things first, Marcus did a basic search for Cade's name, hoping to find some family that might know where he was. Nothing. Well, that would have been too easy anyway. Next, he checked for cameras that might have seen him leaving the field, but the planet lacked a functioning surveillance system. Marcus saw why Cade chose this dump. It seemed like a good place to disappear for a while. He brightened, fired up one of the hacking programs Solomon wrote for him, typed Cade's name, and set it to search every database in the city, starting with the closest and moving out from there. He leaned back in his chair and tapped his chin. Where would Cade have gone? Truth was, he might have gone anywhere. 10 minutes later, the computer chimed and an image of Cade appeared on the screen. He'd checked into a cheap hotel about 5 miles away. Marcus grinned. Time to introduce himself to Mr. Cade. Marcus left the cockpit and rapped on Ayeka's door. It slid open, and she leaned out the doorway. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I've got a line on Cade. Will you keep an eye on things here in case he comes back while I'm gone? She nodded. Be careful. He wanted to kiss her, hug her, pat her on the shoulder, something to reinforce their connection. But instead he headed to the hold to get his bike. He unstrapped it, and with his mask fitted as tight to his face as he could get it, Marcus eased down the ramp. When he was clear, he sealed the ship behind him. It was mid-afternoon local time, but the clouds were so thick it felt like night. He sighed, typed the hotel's location in his computer, and roared off into the murk. Following the directions on his screen, Marcus flew down a pitted and pothole-filled 3-lane highway. Heavy haulers, not dissimilar to the one the mercenaries used on the Pleasure Planet, rumbled down the highway on both sides of him. He felt like a mouse surrounded by rhinos. Even odder was the complete lack of regular family-sized cars. Maybe everyone was still at work. To make his trip more miserable, some genius had decided that since all the vehicles had anti-gravity generators, they didn't need to bother filling the potholes anymore. What he didn't take into account was the holes collected fetid rainwater that splashed up on anyone driving over them. Not a big deal for the haulers, but soon the stinking, polluted water covered Marcus from the knee down. His skin burned under his heavy pants when the water soaked through. He wondered for the 100th time what prompted Cade to come to such a horrid place. At his computer's bidding, he turned off the highway and onto a crowded, narrow city street. Derelict transports lay on the side of the streets in various states of disassembly. Dark, rotting buildings towered over him, their pitted stone walls like decaying skin. Even with his mask, he tasted the harsh, acrid pollution from the factory's smokestacks. He left the commercial area and entered the entertainment district. Strip clubs, whorehouses, peep shows, and bars mingled with an occasional by-the-hour motel. Cade's hotel slumped between a loan office and a drooping 2-story strip club that looked in danger of collapsing at any moment. First class all the way for Mr. Cade. Marcus had no trouble finding an empty parking place on the side of the hotel. He got off his bike and activated every anti-theft device built into it. He took another look around the decaying neighborhood and sent a silent prayer to the powers that be that when he got back his ride would still be there. The front of the hotel held a pair of tarnished bronze and glass doors. He pushed them open and stepped through. The entrance sported a pair of long-dead plants, their dry, leafless branches jutting from a rusty cube filled with dry dirt. A path of dried mud led up to the front desk, behind which a young native slept with his feet up on the counter. Marcus shuddered. What did the rooms look like if this was how they kept the lobby? Then again, who cared? He wasn't planning on staying the night. He walked up to the desk and hit the tarnished silver bell. It didn't make a sound. Someone had removed the striker. probably the unconscious young native in front of him. Resisting the urge to dump him on his bony ass, Marcus gave the kid's booted foot a shake. He snorted in his sleep and slowly opened his eyes. When he spotted Marcus, he took his feet down off the desk and leaned forward. "What?" The service matched the decor, at least. "Which room is Arnold Cade in?" "What the hell business is it of yours?" Marcus clenched his fist, took a breath, and relaxed. He took 2 20-credit coins out of his pocket and slapped them down on the desk. "Which room?" The kid swiped the coins. 12. 3rd floor. He put his feet back up and closed his eyes. Marcus shook his head and headed for the stairs. There was a lift in the corner, but he didn't trust it not to go to pieces halfway up. He took the steps 2 at a time, eager to find Cade and leave the hotel before he caught something. He stepped onto the 3rd floor landing. Across from him was room 6. To his left was room 7, so he went that way. When he reached room 11, he slowed and crept closer, gauntlet raised. The door to room 12 stood open a crack, and inside someone was moving around. He was here. Thank the universe. Marcus peeked through the crack, but saw nothing. A stealthy approach might be best. He nudged the door open, and it let out a horrible creak. A figure in black spun and leveled a blaster. Marcus dropped. A crimson blast took a chunk out of the casing a foot from his head. He countered with a stun blast that went wide. More blasts came his way, forcing Marcus to roll clear of the doorway. After a few seconds, the blasts stopped. Either the intruder had left or was waiting to blast him when he went through the door. Marcus steeled himself. Only one way to find out. He leapt through the doorway, slamming the door out of his way, and slid across the carpet. No one shot at him. The room's only window stood open, and outside a corroded fire escape stretched to the ground. He lowered his gauntlet. Whoever that was, it wasn't Cade. The intruder wasn't big enough to be the former security officer. Something creaked outside the door. Marcus ran across the room in time to see someone with the right build duck around the corner and disappear. Damn it! He missed Cade and let whoever else was looking for him get away. A complete miss. He'd accomplished nothing but ruining his pants and spending 40 credits. Perhaps Cade would run for his ship and Ayeka would have him all tied up when he got back to the landing field. Chapter 9. Marcus got back to the landing field and swung into his hangar. No sign of Cade, bound and unconscious, so he hadn't run for his ship. Too bad. A command from his gauntlet lowered the loading ramp and he drove up into the hold, sealing the ship behind him. Ayeka must have heard him pull in because he'd barely swung his legs over the seat when she stepped through the door. You didn't get him. It was half question and half observation. Marcus shook his head. Worse, I discovered someone else is looking for him, and whoever it is isn't shy about using their blaster. This job just got a lot more complicated. Maybe not. While I was waiting, I did some digging. Cade's got his ship for sale. Marcus frowned. Why would a man on the run give up his main means of transportation? It made no sense, unless he needed money worse than an escape. Let's have a look. They went to the cockpit, and Ayeka pulled up the listing for Cade's ship. Marcus stared at the listing. Only 1 million credits. It was worth twice that as scrap. He must be more desperate for money than Marcus first thought. That could work to their advantage. Great job finding this. You may have solved our problems. Marcus sent a message offering 900,000 in hard credits. If Cade was as eager as Marcus thought, he should jump on the offer. The reply came 4 hours later. The message gave the address of the landing field, the hangar number, and an offer to meet in an hour. Marcus agreed at once. Since he was already here, he'd have plenty of time to get ready. He frowned. It would be better to have backup so Cade didn't get away. Not to mention, keep an eye out for the mystery man. Perhaps Ayeka would lend him a hand one more time. He left the cockpit and made the short walk to her room. When he pressed the chime, she opened up at once. Ayeka wore his favorite snug jeans and a black shirt that hugged her figure. Focusing on the task at hand, he said, Cade's on his way and I could use some backup. Interested? She chewed her lip, and for a moment he feared she might say no. What do you need me to do? He grinned. If this goes okay, nothing. But to be safe, I'd like to set you up with a sniper rifle in the hangar across from Cade's ship. Don't worry, it's got a stun setting. We need him alive anyway. If he tries to run or pulls a blaster, you take him out. If you spot someone in black sneaking around, stun first and ask questions later. I've never used a sniper rifle, not even during basic training. Don't worry, my setup is simple. Come on, I'll show you. Marcus led the way back to the hold and typed his code into the weapon's storage cylinder. It spun around, revealing a delightful assortment of death and destruction. Blasters, pistols, rifles, grenades, his heavy laser cannon, and a dozen blades. He grabbed the longest rifle, a black beast with a carbon fiber barrel and composite stock with folding bipod. Despite its size, it only weighed a couple pounds. He snapped a power cell into the empty slot and flicked the selector switch from safe to stun. A little light beside the switch flashed green. Next he pulled open a narrow drawer. Inside, on a bed of soft cloth, both ends covered with plastic protectors, sat a shiny black scope. Marcus snapped it into place on the rails attached to the top of the rifle stock. There. Isn't she a beauty? He handed the rifle to Ayeka, who gave it a dubious look. Hold it to your shoulder and look through the scope. She popped the plastic covers off and raised the rifle to her shoulder. What now? See the little red dot? Yeah. Put the dot on whatever you want to hit and pull the trigger. It's dead accurate out to 300 yards. Ayeka lowered the rifle. That's it? That's it. Let's get you in place, then I'll head toward the office and approach from that direction in half an hour or so. Marcus gave her a spare mask and they left the ship. Outside, he paused to seal the door and activate the external defenses with his gauntlet. The gloom beyond the hangar seemed thicker. Either night had fallen or one of the factories had belched out an especially noxious wad of pollution. He adjusted his mask and led the way to Hangar 31. No one had claimed it in the last 4 hours, thank the universe. Marcus stopped in the center of the doorway. He could barely make out the ship across the landing strip. Why don't you set up here? You'll have the maximum field of fire. What do you mean, set up? Right. Lower the bipod legs and lay down on your stomach. Get the rifle in a comfortable position and keep watch. Ayeka lay down and wriggled around, trying to get comfortable. Off to the side rested a couple empty parts crates. Marcus grabbed them and set them up to make a simple blind in front of her. He frowned. Not great, but given the crappy visibility, it should work fine. I can barely see anything over there. Ayeka lay in a pretty good imitation of a sniper's sprawl, the rifle tight to her shoulder. Just a second. Marcus fiddled with the controls on the scope until he got the light amplification system going. How's that? Better. I can see everything in the hangar. Shit, someone's over there. Marcus checked the watch in his gauntlet. 20 minutes until the meeting. Either Cade arrived early or something was wrong. Are you good here? I need to get going. I'm fine. Go. After a second's hesitation, Marcus jogged off toward the office. He didn't dare go too fast or he'd get out of breath. The last thing he wanted was to take deep breaths of the corrupt air, mask or not. He reached the office without meeting another soul. One thing about the miserable place, no one went outside unless they had to. He took a couple shallow breaths to steady himself and turned toward Cade's hangar. He ambled along, trying to get into the role of a ship buyer looking for a deal. Someone that had never heard of Arnold Cade before today and had no idea what sort of horrible things he'd done. When he reached the hangar, Marcus forced himself not to glance across the strip and try to spot Ayeka. Hello? A stocky, square-jawed man appeared in the hangar doorway as though materializing out of the murk. You hear about the ship? Marcus forced a smile. That's right. When I saw your ad, I thought it might be a misprint, so I hurried over before someone else could snag it. Cade grunted. A real charmer, this one. I suppose you want to take a look. Certainly. Cade turned back into the hangar, and Marcus followed. The ship looked the same as he remembered, only now the back ramp was open. His host took one step up the ramp before a crimson blaster bolt streaked past his head and burned into the hole. Marcus dove under the ramp a second ahead of another blast. That wasn't Ayeka. The rifle he'd given her fired blue pulses. Worse, Those shots weren't stun blasts. A third shot blasted through the open door, and Cade shouted, "Damn it! If they killed Cade, he'd never find out where he took Solomon." Marcus lunged out from under the ramp, zigzagged a couple times, and ran up into the ship. He found Cade lying on the floor, clutching his right leg. A black hole burned into him just below the knee. Marcus grabbed him by the collar and dragged him deeper into the ship, hopefully out of blaster range. "Got any weapons on board?" Cade snarled and shook his head.
"Sold 'em."
Great. Marcus tapped the weapons module on his gauntlet and fired a stun blast into Cade. He wasn't going anywhere for a while. Now he needed to figure out who was trying to kill him. Much as he hated to draw attention to Ayeka, he needed to know what she saw. He activated his comm. "Ayeka, can you hear me? What the hell's going on? Was that blaster fire?" "Relax. Someone shot Cade in the leg. I assume it's whoever I jumped at the hotel, but I can't see anything. We've got cover inside the ship, so we're in no danger for the moment. Can you see anything?" A moment of silence. "There's nothing visible from here." Shit, so much for that. He grinned when a new plan occurred to him. "Keep your eyes peeled. I'll try to flush him out." Marcus located the control panel in the central pillar and raised the ramp. He went to the cockpit and found everything lit up. He sighed in relief. Cade had powered it all up in preparation for his buyer arriving. Marcus hopped into the pilot's seat and studied the controls. A control stick with weapons control, readouts, gauges, and on the floor left and right rudder. Looked simple enough. He powered up the main cannons, activated the anti-gravity generator, feeding it just enough power to get the landing gear off the ground, then spun the ship so the guns faced toward where the blasts originated. Nothing on the screen or scanners. Where the hell was he? Marcus shrugged and fired. Crimson blasts streaked out and exploded, the flames burning away the murk and revealing a figure in a close-fitting black bodysuit, probably stealth-capable, which explained why he couldn't pick up anything on his scanners. He adjusted the ship and fired again, sending the assassin scrambling, his blaster rifle forgotten, right into Ayeka's line of fire. Sure enough, a moment later, a blue pulse lanced out and the assassin dropped. Marcus set the ship down and rushed out of the cockpit. Cade was still out cold, but Marcus took the time to drag him into a cell and lock it down. Prisoner secure, he lowered the ramp and ran out toward the prone assassin, gauntlet raised. When he was a couple steps away and the unconscious killer still hadn't moved, he popped the studs on his gauntlet, bent down and jabbed the prone figure, sending a stun pulse into his back. He wouldn't be going anywhere. Ayeka ran up, rifle clutched in her arms. "Are you okay?" The concern in her voice warmed Marcus's heart. Maybe there was still hope for them. "Fine." Cade singed but breathing and locked in one of his own cells. "Great shot." She offered a hesitant smile. "When you fired those cannons, I about jumped out of my skin." Marcus grinned. "Worked, though. Let's see who we have here." He pulled the assassin's mask off and a mass of blonde hair tumbled out. Marcus brushed it aside, revealing a small upturned nose, full lips and closed eyes. She had a small scar on her cheek, but no other markings. She was kind of cute if you were into killers. "Who is she?" Ayeka asked, like he and the assassin were old friends. "Beats me, but she's definitely a pro. That stealth suit probably cost 250,000 credits. Let's lock her in a cell before she wakes up. Can you get her rifle?" Marcus stood in the hold of Cade's transport and watched his unconscious prisoners. Cade's wound was ugly, but not fatal. Ayeka had stripped the woman of her stealth suit along with several knives, a stun grenade, and a holdout blaster. She lay on the cold steel floor wearing nothing but lacy red underwear. Surprisingly girly for a contract killer. The moment they finished securing the assassin, he'd gone to the office and explained to the owner that everything was under control and he didn't need to call the authorities. The bald man had grunted once in a combined acknowledgement and dismissal, and turned his attention back to whatever he was working on. "So what do we do now?" Ayeka sat on a crate she brought in from the hangar, both blaster rifles on the floor beside her. "Now we wake him up and find out where he took Solomon." Marcus went to the ship's small bathroom and fetched 2 cups of water. "What if he won't talk?" Ayeka locked gazes with him. He knew what she wanted him to say, that he wouldn't beat the information out of Cade. He wanted to say it too, but he refused to lie to her. If he had to beat the man within an inch of his life to find Solomon, he'd do it without a second thought. He'll talk. Marcus tossed a cup of water in Cade's face and he sputtered awake.
What? Where?
He groaned when the pain of his leg hit him. Morning, sunshine. Enjoy your nap? Cade oriented on him.
You don't want to buy my ship, do you?
Marcus shook his head. This guy was clearly not the brightest bulb. You don't miss a trick. Seems you took a friend of mine off Pleasure Planet 4 a little while ago. I need you to tell me where you took him. Cade's eyes narrowed.
In exchange for what?
Marcus shifted his gaze to the unconscious woman. See that girl? She's the one who shot you. You are what's called a loose end. Whoever you delivered my friend to probably hired her to keep you from talking to me. Now, if you don't tell me what I want to know, I'll wake her up, open the cage door, and give her a knife. Cade's throat worked as he tried to swallow.
And if I tell you?
You tell me and she stays locked up and unarmed. I send you home to face a trial and probably prison.
That's a hell of a choice.
Marcus shrugged. If this asshole was looking for sympathy, he was looking in the wrong place. He tossed the second cup of water on the assassin. You should have thought of that earlier. She sputtered awake, spun to her feet and lunged through the bars of the cell to try to get to Cade. That she was almost naked didn't faze her in the least. You had to respect that sort of focus. Calm down. Those cells were designed to stop neighbors from strangling each other. She speared him with a penetrating glare. Who are you? Another hunter? He's my mark, and it's a closed contract. You can't poach him. Guild rules. Marcus smiled at her anger. Lucky for me, I'm not a member of your guild, or any other for that matter. My interest in this turd is personal. He shifted his focus back to Cade. So what about it? You want to answer my questions, or do I turn you over to the young lady?
All right. You win. I took them to a ship. A big one. Looked like some kind of bulk hauler converted into a personal transport. Never seen anything like it.
Marcus ground his teeth. If Solomon was on a ship, he could be anywhere. Who took the delivery?
Don't know his name. Old guy, horns, white chin whiskers. He was a jerk. Arrogant, like. Still, $500,000 in hard credits makes up for a lot.
The assassin flinched, just a little, when she heard Cade's description. Marcus recognized it all too well. Dorne Carrick. After 3 years, he finally decided to get revenge. Why now? What happened to make Dorne go after Solomon? Friend of yours? Ayeka asked. Marcus nodded. An old enemy. Not even ours, really. We did a job that cost him some money. In fact, the lady that hired us might have a line on Dorne. He jumped to his feet, went to the cockpit, and dropped into the pilot's chair. The fuel gauge read full, but even so, the ship didn't have enough range to reach Smith. A quick command pulled up the navigation window. He searched for the closest bit of civilization to the pleasure planet Cade's transport could reach. A small satellite refueling station popped up, and Marcus set that as the autopilot's destination, set a 5-minute delay, and clicked activate. He typed the satellite's location into his gauntlet, then rejoined Ayeka in the hold. Ready?
Hey, what about me?
Cade asked. Marcus ignored him as well as the assassin's cold glare. He could probably add her to his ever-growing list of enemies. Oh well, what was one more at this point? Ayeka stood up and collected the rifles. Marcus grabbed the stealth suit and miscellaneous weapons. Together they left the transport, and Marcus led the way across the landing strip to the empty hangar where Ayeka had hid before the fight. 4 minutes later, the ramp closed, the engines fired up, and the transport lifted off. He watched until the murk swallowed the engines. Marcus turned toward their hangar, eager to get off this filthy planet. Princess Land would know where to find Dorne if anyone did. He'd gotten to like the princess during their short time together, and despite the desperation of the situation, it would be good to see her again. We still have no destination, Ayeka said. No, but we know who we're looking for. An acquaintance of mine might have a line on him, and if she does, she'll tell us, since she hates him more than he hates Solomon and me. An ex-girlfriend? He thought he heard a hint of jealousy in her question, but it might have been wishful thinking. Marcus laughed, deactivated the star's external defenses, and lowered the ramp. No, an ex-client. She hired us to get her away from Dorne. Marcus led the way up the ramp. When they were both inside, he sealed the ship, and a few seconds later the filtration system scrubbed the pollution from the air. Marcus pulled off his mask and tossed it back in the odds and ends bin. If he never had to wear that thing again, it would suit him fine. He moved on to the weapons bin and stored Ayeka's rifle along with his new toys from the assassin. He'd have to sell the stealth suit. His shoulders were way too broad to fit. So are you going to tell me about the client, or do I have to guess? While he stored the remaining weapons, Marcus told her about the job and Dorne's attempt to force Land to marry him so he could get his claws on her credits. When he finished, she said, "That's terrible. No wonder she hates him." "Yeah, even better for us, she's a little scared of him." Marcus headed toward the cockpit. "I hope that means she has someone keeping an eye on Dorne. If she doesn't know where we can find him, we're screwed." Chapter 10. Solomon sat in his hard little chair at the plain steel table, doing his best to look busy, all the while trying to think of some way they might escape. Emily sat beside him on the edge of her bunk. After a day in their spacious cell, she seemed to shake off the worst of her anxiety, thank the universe. He had enough on his mind without worrying about her bursting into tears at any moment. Despite his best efforts, he saw no way past their first obstacle, the sealed cell door. He had no tools and no access to the system that ran this place, whatever it was. He typed a couple more lines of code just to make it look like he was accomplishing something. Solomon had no idea if the room had cameras, but he assumed it did. "You don't seem to be making much progress," Emily said. Solomon turned her way. "I'm not exactly in a hurry. Once this is done, we become unnecessary. Becoming unnecessary isn't conducive to a long, healthy life." Her jaw dropped a little. "You don't think they'll let us go once you give them the program?" Solomon shook his head. She couldn't be that naive. "Let's say I have my doubts." The room shook, and the computer on his desk rattled. Emily clutched his arm. What the hell was that? "What was that?" she asked as though reading his mind. "It almost felt like we hit something." Solomon's eyes widened. "Or docked with something. We must be on a ship, a big one. Damn it! How's Marcus supposed to find us if we're moving around?" "If we've docked, we aren't moving now. That should help." She was trying so hard to make him feel better he didn't have the heart to tell her they could be anywhere by now. He patted her hand. "It certainly won't hurt." Solomon turned his attention back to his program. He structured it to be fully self-contained. That would make it easy to install and, assuming he lived through this, later remove. He'd designed it so the Council's virus checker wouldn't notice it during routine scans. That was easy enough. He'd helped write the virus scan program. The door hissed open and Dorne stepped through. Progress report. "I've got the basic structure built," Solomon said. He didn't know how much Dorne knew about programming, so he didn't want to lay on the bullshit too thick. "I'm optimizing now. Once I'm finished, I need to write insertion and activation programs. Once those are done, you'll be all set." Solomon thought he could hear Dorne's teeth grinding from the other side of the room. He hoped the bastard cracked a tooth. "How long?" 2, maybe 3 days. This isn't a simple process, even for me. The Council's computer system is one of the most complex in the galaxy. Even when I finish, it may not work the first time." Dorne pulled out the remote and pointed it at Emily like a blaster. "It better, or you won't be the one to suffer." He spun in a whirl of blue silk and stalked out. Solomon glanced at Emily, afraid she might freak out again. She seemed okay, to his relief. "He doesn't know much about programming. This sort of code rarely works the first time. Under different circumstances, I'd spend weeks tweaking before I tried it." Emily blinked and let go of his arm. "I don't think we have weeks." The star emerged from hyperspace a short distance from Tricella Prime. On the screen, puffy white clouds swirled above glittering green oceans. Marcus smiled, remembering when he and Solomon brought land back home. It didn't look like the planet had changed a bit in 3 years. The computer beeped when the defense satellites contacted them. Marcus hit the flashing red light. State your name and purpose of your visit. This is Marcus Drake, captain of the Rogue Star. I'm here to visit an old friend. I believe she's expecting me. The automated welcome system switched over to a live person. Welcome, Captain Drake. Princess Land said you were coming. She's waiting for you at the Royal Palace. Transmitting coordinates and flight path now. Welcome back to Tricella. Marcus activated the autopilot and let it follow the path provided. He turned to Ayeka. Where do you see the palace? I'm pretty sure they grew it out of some sort of crystal. There are fountains, gardens, and waterfalls all over the grounds. It may be one of, if not the most beautiful place I've ever visited. It's got to be better than the last place we visited. Marcus laughed. You won't need a mask, that's for certain. A couple minutes later, the gleaming blue and rose crystal towers of the Tricella Royal Palace filled the screen. Marcus took control back from the autopilot and landed on a pad barely big enough to accommodate the ship. He shouldn't be surprised. Even small cargo ships took up a lot more space than a personal transport. When the ship had settled on her landing gear, Marcus powered down and he and Ayeka headed back to the hold. He paused beside Gruesome. Guard mode. Non-lethal force only. The warbot's eyes flashed green and a pair of stun blasters popped out of 2 of his fingers. He continued on to the control panel and lowered the ramp. Ayeka stood beside him while they waited for the ramp to reach the ground. Even here you don't trust anyone? I trust lots of people here, but I don't know everyone in the palace, much less on the planet. Better safe than dead, I always say. The ramp clunked onto the white stone of the landing pad. They walked down the ramp and started along a wide path toward the palace. The white stone gleamed in the sun, and Marcus would have bet good credits that some poor servant had polished the path that morning. It made a nice contrast to the sort of place he usually ended up. 3 figures emerged from the palace, 2 big ones on either side of a small one. He couldn't make out much detail, but he had a good idea Land and 2 of her bodyguards had come to meet them. He smiled when 50 yards away she broke from her guards and ran toward him. Marcus! The princess had grown a few inches since the last time he saw her, but she still had the same willowy build, shining black hair, and bright smile. The thin line on her forehead was the only sign of her closed third eye. She held her arms out, and he obliged, picking her up and spinning her around once before the guards arrived. I missed you! It's good to see you again, Princess. Marcus gestured toward Ayeka. This is a new friend of mine, Ayeka Kazumi. Ayeka, let me introduce Princess Land, former client and all-around lovely young lady. Land held out a hand and Ayeka gave it a light shake. I know you. I saw you on the news a few months ago. You're a hero like Marcus. Welcome to Tricella. Ayeka glanced at him. She looked a little uncomfortable, whether from the informal greeting or the idea that Land considered him a hero he couldn't say. Thank you, Princess. The guards wore blue helmets with blue crystal stars on the forehead, and fine mesh armor that reminded Marcus of ancient mail worn by knights. Of course, he suspected this armor was a good deal stronger and blaster-resistant. They reached the princess and took up position on either side of her before offering Marcus a professional glower. Either indifferent to or unaware of her guard's irritation, Land said, Let's go in and have a snack. My head of security is looking into that awful man's whereabouts and will join us when she knows something. Marcus, Ayeka, and Land sat around a crystal table that appeared grown out of the floor. Delicate cups and plates made of crystal so thin Marcus feared to touch them, bearing a variety of small sandwiches and tea, sat on the tabletop. The 3 of them sat in a small, private room deep in the palace. Land chattered happily about her life since he brought her home. Marcus only half listened, his mind on Solomon and what might be happening to him. So you rule the entire planet? Ayeka asked. Land's laugh held the innocent joy of a child. Heavens, no. I don't have much real power. I'm what's the word? Yes, a figurehead. The Council of Lords rules our system. My job is to entertain foreign dignitaries, attend ribbon cuttings, and ride at the front of parades. It's quite tedious at times, but given where I may have ended up if dear Marcus hadn't come to my rescue, I don't complain." Ayeka looked at him again, but he couldn't read her expression. A knock sounded, and the door opened halfway. An older woman, with streaks of white in her dark hair and wrinkles around her third eye, poked her head in. "I have the information you requested, Majesty." "Come in, Nina. You remember Marcus?" Nina inclined her head a fraction in Marcus's direction. "Captain Drake?" Marcus nodded back. "Commander? You located Dorne?" She glanced at Land, who nodded. "We know where he is. Since his attempt to force himself on the princess, we've kept him under near constant surveillance. He recently returned to his home base, a space station constructed from several separate satellites. He travels in a heavily modified ore hauler." "His location?" Marcus leaned forward, eager now that he was so close to finding Solomon. "The arrogant fellow has made his home in the next system. I have no proof, but I suspect he does it to insult us." She handed him a printout with the exact coordinates. "What are your intentions, Captain?" "I'll ask him nicely to let Solomon and his girlfriend go. If he refuses, I'll ask less nicely." Nina nodded. "I recommend you skip step 1 and go right to step 2. Marcus got up. "I'll take that under consideration. Thanks for your help." She waved off his gratitude. "I'm just doing my job. Thank Her Majesty." Nina left, and Ayeka and Land rose as well. "Do you have to leave already, Marcus?" Land stuck her bottom lip out in an adorable pout. "Sorry, Princess, but my friend is in trouble and I don't dare delay. It was great seeing you, and thanks for the food. It was much better than anything I could fix on the Star." "I'll extend your compliments to the chef, and please don't wait so long to visit me next time." She hugged Marcus, who patted her back. Land escorted them to the palace gate, then left them to make the walk back to the ship on their own. Marcus sighed. She was a sweet kid, but he was pretty sure everyone else at the palace hated him. "She's got a crush on you." A faint smile played around Ayeka's lips. "I got her out of a rough spot, and she's kind of turned me into some sort of knight in shining armor. If she knew the real me, I doubt I'd get another invitation to tea." Ayeka shook her head. "The real you is a hero. Perhaps not a knight in shining armor, but a hero just the same. How many people's lives have you saved over the years? Mine several times. Solomon's several times. Land's." Marcus looked away. "How does that stack up against the lives I've taken? Most of them deserved it, but I still killed them. And if I have to, I'll kill more of them to get Solomon back." They walked up the ramp, and Marcus shut it behind him. No unconscious bodies littered the hold, so he assumed no one had tried to sneak on board. He patted Gruesome on the leg and headed for the cockpit. "How old is she, anyway?" 19. Her parents died in a shuttle accident when she was 13, and she fell into the custody of her aunt and uncle, the ones that tried to sell her into Dorne's bed. I almost killed them both when I found out. I'm surprised they haven't found someone else to marry her off to by now. Land has a mind of her own, and she's an adult now, so no one can force her to do anything she doesn't have a mind to do. Which is good, as I have no desire to sneak her off yet another planet." Ayeka laughed as he powered up the ship. "Don't kid me. If she was in trouble and called, you'd drop everything and try to help her. Risks be damned." Marcus smiled. "As long as she calls after I find Solomon, yeah, you're probably right." He took off and flew through a bank of fluffy clouds. When he cleared the atmosphere, Marcus punched in the coordinates and fired up the hyperdrive. "You handle the ship pretty well, considering you lost your navigator," Ayeka said. "Remember, I flew by myself for years before Solomon snuck on board. I set up the controls so that I can do everything from the pilot station. Solomon makes things faster and easier, but I can manage on my own if I have to." Marcus flipped a lever, and they shot into hyperspace. Chapter 11. Solomon worked as fast as he could, given the pressure. He'd been at it almost non-stop for a day and a half. He had to stop soon and sleep. His mind kept wandering from the task at hand to Dorne threatening Emily. Solomon looked over at her, asleep on her cot. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. It was his fault she got dragged into this. Damn it. He found a mistake and had to delete 2 lines of code. His hands trembled with exhaustion. What had turned out to be a good excuse to drag the process out and thus extend their lives a few more days now threatened to cause Emily real trouble. Well, he'd do what he could do as fast as he could do it. Solomon looked away from the screen and rubbed his dry, scratchy eyes. He only had a couple hours' work left, but if he tried to do it now, he might screw up the whole program. He yawned. A few hours' sleep, then he'd finish up, cross his fingers, and hope Dorne didn't kill them on the spot. He stood up from the hard chair. His back popped and his legs ached like he'd run a mile. Definitely time for a nap. The door slid open, and Dorne entered. "Is it ready?" He sounded desperate, almost terrified. Emily sat up and looked back and forth between them, wide-eyed and afraid. "A few more hours and I'll have it. I have to rest. I can barely keep my eyes open." Dorne dragged the remote out of his pocket and pointed it at Emily, his hand trembling. "No rest, no excuses. Finish it now." "I can barely keep the screen in focus. If I continue now, I'll screw it up and have to start over." "You've waited this long. Is a few more hours that important?" The door slid open, and a nightmare floated in. The man, at least Solomon assumed it had been a man at some point, had a black weapons module grafted below its left elbow, and someone had replaced the top of its head with a steel dome from which wires ran to a lens in its right eye socket. Its body below the waist was gone, replaced by an oblong anti-gravity unit. Horrifying as the amalgamation was, Solomon was most concerned about the weapons module. It was clearly void tech, and if Dorne had gotten a hold of it, helping him was even more dangerous than Solomon first thought. "You're too gentle," the monstrosity's voice hissed and crackled like a comm unit stuck between frequencies. A blade snapped out of the weapons module and it drifted over towards Emily. "I will remove her hand. If the program is not ready in 1 hour, I will remove the other." Emily screamed and looked at Dorne. "This wasn't part of our deal!" She ripped the collar off and tossed it across the room. "Deal?" She was in on it. He slumped back down into his chair. She'd been in on it from the start. She tricked him into liking her so Dorne could threaten her and he'd do whatever they wanted. How could he have been so stupid? Marcus said you should trust no one you haven't gone to war with. But did he listen when a pretty girl paid attention to him? No. He jumped in with both feet, eyes clenched firmly shut. "Solomon!" Her scream dragged him back to the moment. The cyborg thing was only a couple feet from her now. Solomon took in the scene and felt nothing. All his protective urges washed away by her betrayal. A part of him wanted to see her lose a hand, to see her suffer for making a fool of him. The practical side of him pointed out that if her suffering wouldn't get him to do what they wanted, the monster would soon turn its attention to him. "All right. 1 hour, just leave her alone." The cyborg spun to face him. The lens in its eye extended and twisted, then slid back. It nodded once, the blade snapping back into its housing. "I will return in an hour. If I see no images of the council chamber, the woman dies." It flew back out the door, leaving a shaken Solomon to figure out how he'd get 3 hours' work done in 1. Dorne shot him one last, pleading look, then followed the monster out. It looked like Dorne and that thing had some issues. When they had gone, Emily ran over and hugged him. "You saved me. Thank you." Solomon shrugged her off and turned back to the computer. "Who do you think they'll cut when they're finished with you? Now shut up and let me concentrate." She flinched as if he'd slapped her. What did she expect now that he knew what she'd done? If by some miracle they got out of this mess alive, he never wanted to lay eyes on her again, and he fully intended to send the nastiest virus he knew to her hypernet address. "Please, Solomon. I didn't have a choice. I borrowed money from him, then I couldn't pay it back. When he made me an offer to work it off, I had to do it. You've seen what these people are like. You know what they would have done to me if I hadn't done what they wanted." He looked at her. She had tears in her eyes and trembled from head to toe. He felt nothing. No pity. No sympathy. The bitch had used him to save herself, and now they were both probably going to die. One of them, at least, deserved it. I don't care. Now shut your mouth so I can try to save both our lives. The star emerged from hyperspace in stealth mode about 100,000 miles from the coordinates Nina had provided. The jump had only taken an hour, and now on the main screen, magnified so they could get a good look at it, floated Dorne's space station. It looked like something a kid would cobble together out of spare blocks. 3 cylindrical units connected by rigid walkways formed the bulk of the structure. Marcus counted 5 heavy weapons emplacements. At the top, the ore hauler connected to the station via an extended docking tube. 3 long arms ending in claws emerged from the station to hold it in place. The scanners picked up over 100 life forms on the station and 20 on the hauler. That was a hell of a lot more to deal with than 8 mercenaries. I don't suppose you have a plan, Ayeka said. I'm working on it. If I just knew where he was, it would be so much easier. Marcus turned his attention to the scanners. There were life forms everywhere. He guided the ship around the station, trying to find somewhere to dock without everyone in the place noticing. There were several airlocks, but if they were locked, he'd have to blast them open, which would draw every guard in the place. He reached the far side and stopped. The hangar of the ore carrier didn't have a door, just a force field. That seemed insanely risky. If the ship lost power, they'd lose their atmosphere. He eased closer and focused his scanners on the hangar. There were no life forms present. It couldn't be that easy. He scanned for traps, explosives, or computer-controlled cannons guarding the hangar entrance and found nothing. Someone had left the back door open. It would be that stupid. There was nothing for it. He flew them closer and still nothing detected them. Nothing obvious, anyway. Marcus shrugged and flew through the force field. Nothing happened. Not even an alarm sounded. They were in. He landed gently, expecting at any moment to see guards pouring through the door in the far wall. Marcus left everything running, the shields and cloaking device up and the autoguns on. Anyone approaching the ship would get a face full of plasma. He turned to Ayeka. Do you want to wait here or come with me? She got up. He's my friend too. I'm coming. Marcus grinned. Then let's go. They headed back to the hold. Marcus accessed the weapons locker and examined his selection of death dealers. He would have preferred to wear his armor, but it made way too much noise to be of use sneaking around. A pair of his new blasters rested in a 2-gun belt, and he strapped them on. That should be enough firepower. Next, he slipped on a chest harness with a micro-shield generator. That would take care of any small arms fire. Next, he filled a satchel with a variety of bombs and grenades, along with a hand scanner loaded with Solomon's biosignature. He finished up by strapping on his gauntlet. One of us should take an ion pistol. Ayeka examined his collection of weapons and shook her head. Are there more than last time? Not a lot more, and now we don't need an ion pistol. He patted his new blasters. These are the latest in Vinsar shield-penetrating blasters. Drakor hooked me up with 4 of them after we ran into the Void Assassins. When Ayeka had what she wanted from the weapons locker, including her own personal shield, he looked her up and down. His gaze lingered on her curves more than her weapons. At last he nodded. Almost ready. He clipped an identifier chip to her weapons belt, then clipped one to his own. There, now the computer won't blast us by accident when we leave. That's good to know. Outside the ship, Marcus went over to the 2 fighters and placed a remote detonated bomb on each one. He walked up to the door leading deeper into the ship and understood why they didn't worry about losing atmosphere. A 6-inch thick shielded blast door separated the hangar from the rest of the ship. Marcus doubted a direct hit from the star's main cannons would penetrate it. Perfect. He was inside, but only marginally better off than when he was outside. How the hell was he supposed to get through a door that thick? A blaster in one hand and his gauntlet ready on the other, he moved over beside the control panel. He'd feel like an idiot if he didn't at least try to open the door. Beside him, Ayeka had her own weapon out, a grim expression on her face. She looked ready for a fight, and that reassured him. He reached for the button to open the door and looked at her. She nodded once, and he hit it. Nothing happened. Well, that had been a dim prospect anyway. Damn it! He slammed his gauntlet against the door. It made an awful clang, drawing a wince, followed at once by a smile. If he couldn't open it, he'd have to get someone else to do it for him. He pounded on the door with the grip of his blaster. The noise hurt his ears, but someone on the other side had to hear it. He kept at it for a full minute until a light flashed on the control panel. The doors groaned and moved. He slipped to one side and Ayeka went to the other. The door parted enough for him to see a single figure on the other side. Marcus sent a stun pulse into his face. The person dropped, and the door continued to slide open. When it had opened all the way, Marcus crouched beside the unconscious figure. He looked young, with a shaved head and some sort of port built into his chest. His left arm ended in a 3-fingered metal claw. Marcus shook his head. What the hell had they done to the kid? Grab a leg. Marcus grabbed one, Ayeka took the other, and between them they dragged the unconscious man into the hangar. What do you make of him? Looks like someone used him as a subject in an experiment, Ayeka said. I somehow doubt it was voluntary. They dropped the unconscious man's legs on the floor. We need to get moving. Beyond the blast door was a long hall stretching left and right as far as he could see. Dull gray steel broken by an occasional scuffed stainless steel door. Marcus took out his scanner and switched it on. Now that he was inside the ship, he hoped to get a fix on Solomon's location. According to the scanner, he needed to go forward and to his left. He went to the first door to his left, and it opened at his approach. Another hall stretched out before him. He checked the scanner, 300 feet forward and to the left. Marcus slipped down the hall, ears straining for any sign of opposition. In the distance, some machinery wheezed and clanged, but nothing that indicated trouble. They eased their way down the hall. Marcus forced himself to relax his jaw before he broke a tooth. A motor whirled to life behind him. Marcus spun, leveled his blaster, and fired. His blast blew a hole through the chest of an armless man with steel tentacles growing out his back. What sort of horror show had they wandered into here? He winced at the scream of the blaster. That shot would draw every guard in the place. What was that thing? Ayeka shook her head. I have no idea. I'm a biologist. I study nature. That thing and the other one we left in the hangar have nothing to do with nature. Marcus couldn't argue with that. He checked the scanner again, another 100 feet. He picked up the pace, no longer worried about his steps clanging on the metal floor. After the blaster shot, it sounded like a whisper. Marcus stopped in front of a door that didn't open at his approach. A control panel on the wall beside it had a number pad and a message requesting he input the access code. Marcus switched his gauntlet to EMP mode and input a small lightning bolt. The panel sparked, and the door slid open. Inside, Solomon sat slumped over a computer terminal. Seated on a cot on the far side of the room was the girl he'd only seen in the security recordings from their hotel. He'd found them, at last. Chapter 12. Solomon didn't even lift his head at the sound of the door opening. It's done. Will you please leave me alone? Marcus stepped into the room. I could do that, but I thought you might like a lift out of here. Solomon spun around so fast he almost fell out of his chair. His sigh of relief so pitiful Marcus could only shake his head. I didn't think you'd be able to find us. Marcus grinned. It wasn't easy, I'll tell you. You can thank Princess Land. Her security people had Dorne under surveillance. Solomon got up and staggered over to him. He had dark circles under red eyes. It didn't look like they'd let him sleep for days. Solomon stumbled and Marcus caught his friend before he fell. He helped Solomon over to the empty cot. I really need a nap. That's fine, but not just now. Marcus, they're coming. Ayeka had her head stuck out the busted door. We're cut off. How many? Marcus eased his friend down. A lot. All of them like the ones we've seen. It looks like a bus ran into a scrap hauler and they got all smushed together. Shit. Marcus, Solomon groaned and leaned forward. Be careful, they're using void tech. How in the galaxy did this lot of misfits get access to void tech? It didn't matter. They needed to get through them and back to the star. He dug a grenade out of his satchel, walked to the doorway, pulled the pin, and threw it down the hall. A couple seconds later, an explosion that made his blaster shot seem quiet shook the floor. He stuck his head out. Smoke filled the hall, and a few bodies lay on the floor. Beyond them, indistinct figures moved in the haze. He might have bought a few minutes at best. I need to get to the bridge. Can you hold the door by yourself? Ayeka stared at him for a moment. Do I have a choice? Not really. Solomon levered himself off the cot. I can help. You can barely stand. Marcus helped Solomon over beside the door and shrugged out of his grenade satchel. Here, when Ayeka tells you, throw one down the hall. I'll be back as fast as I can. Tell me you have a plan. The desperation in Ayeka's voice strengthened his determination. He'd get them all out of this no matter what. I do. It's not a good plan, but given our circumstances, I'm going with it. If you feel the ship start to rattle, hang on to something. Ayeka grabbed the front of his shirt, yanked him close, and kissed him hard on the lips. Don't you dare get yourself killed. Not a chance. Marcus pulled his blasters and laid down a barrage of fire. He ducked out the door and ran in the opposite direction from the freaks at the end of the hall. He made it to the end without so much as a stray blast skipping off his shield. The hall branched left and right. He went right on instinct. Truth was, Marcus had no idea how best to reach the bridge. He moved based on what he saw when they circled the structure outside. He ran a few strides, then skidded to a halt in front of a lift. Before he hit the call button, a monstrosity with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a spider skittered out from a side hall and started toward him. Marcus put 2 blasts through its human torso. It collapsed, but the spider legs scratched at the metal floor, making a horrid screeching that set his teeth on edge as they tried to reach him. 2 more shots through the center of its mass elicited a shower of sparks, and the legs went still. Marcus shuddered and hit the call button. He'd never especially liked spiders, and he found he liked giant half-metal, half-human ones even less. A chime sounded, and the lift doors opened. A surprised, mostly flesh and blood 4-armed alien stared at him for the instant it took Marcus to put a shot between his eyes. The unfortunate alien's head blew apart like an overripe squash hitting the floor. The dead alien slumped to the ground, half in and half out of the lift. Sorry about this. He stepped over the corpse, turned and kicked it clear of the doors. They slid shut and Marcus studied the control panel. He hit the top floor. It looked from the outside that the bridge sat at the highest point of the ship. Tuneless instrumental music played as he shot up 5 levels. Another chime sounded and the door slid open, revealing a large room with half a dozen computer stations. 3 all-flesh-and-blood aliens with spiral horns shouted about intruders and seemed uncertain what they should do about it. He'd found the bridge. Perfect. Marcus fired a blast into the ceiling and the crew fell silent. They stared at him with wide eyes. Who's in charge? One of the aliens stepped hesitantly forward. I'm Master Carrick, second in command. Do you pilot the ship? He shook his head and pointed at one of the others. He's our pilot. Excellent. I didn't want to shoot the wrong person. He turned his focus on the pilot. I'd like you to fly us out of here. Now. The pilot looked at his commander. Marcus leveled his blaster at the second-in-command's head and fired a screaming shot that skimmed past his ear to burn a shallow divot in the floor. Your compliance isn't optional. Do it now. The pilot needed no further prompting. He rushed to his station and started typing commands. A vibration ran through the hull as he powered up the engines. I can retract the docking tube, but the claws are controlled in the station. Don't worry, just give the engines full power. Something will give. The pilot swallowed. I have no idea what might happen if I do that. Marcus leveled his second blaster at him. I'm pretty sure I know which button to punch to get the engines going. I promise you, whatever happens, it'll be better for you than what's going to happen if you don't do what I say. The trembling pilot nodded and swiped forward across the station. Marcus braced himself, never taking his focus off the 3 members of the bridge crew. The vibrations increased, rattling the hull. The hauler shook and metal shrieked. All at once they surged forward. Marcus staggered. The second in command fell on his face, and the third member of the group shot him a narrow-eyed look. Hopefully the guy wouldn't do anything stupid. He'd killed enough people over the last week, he didn't need to add another one to the list. One of the stations lit up and alarms sounded. "What is that?" "Damage report." The second in command got to his feet. "It sounds like you broke Master Carrick's ship. If Dorne loses nothing more than a ship before this day's over, he can consider himself lucky." Marcus leveled his gauntlet and stunned all three of them in rapid succession. He needed to get back to Solomon and Ayeka and off this dying ship. Solomon couldn't believe his eyes. When he learned they were on a ship, he figured Marcus would never find him. But there he stood in the doorway, the familiar grin in place. Solomon almost wept. Now, mere moments after he believed himself safe for the first time in days, blaster fire was pounding the wall a few feet from his head, and he had a satchel of grenades on his lap. He leaned out, trying to see past Ayeka. A crimson bolt charred a black circle on the doorway 6 inches from his face. He jerked back to a safe distance. "Solomon, grenade!" Ayeka fired a stream of blaster bolts down the hall. He pawed through the satchel. There were explosive grenades, smoke grenades, a couple ion grenades, even an adhesive grenade. "What kind?" "The kind that blows up." Excellent. Marcus had brought the most of that kind. He grabbed a round one, pulled the pin, and threw it through the doorway past Ayeka. An explosion rocked the hall, and for a second the enemy fire stopped. Ayeka leaned back from the open door, sweat plastered her hair to her face. "What's Marcus doing?" Solomon asked. "The same thing he always does. Make it up as he goes." She sounded annoyed. Getting trapped, then shot at, would do that to a person. A vibration ran through Solomon. They fired up the engines. A few seconds later, the horrible shriek of metal tearing followed by screams from the hall. Ayeka stuck her head out, then pulled it back in. "They're running away. Somehow he did it." She shook her head as though not believing it. Another rattle followed by an explosion. Smoke from something billowed down the hall. "Don't celebrate yet," Solomon said. More of the awful screeches, followed by more explosions. It sounded like the ship was breaking up. The freaks from the hall probably ran toward the escape pods. That didn't strike Solomon as such a bad idea just then. Emily bounced up from the cot. "We have to get out of here." She ran toward the door. Ayeka reached to try to stop her, but Solomon shook his head. "Let her go." Emily darted out the door. Ayeka turned to look at him. "She might get killed out there." "I doubt it. Emily works for Dorne. She has from the beginning. Meeting her was all a setup." "I'm sorry. I know you liked her." A different, higher-pitched squeal sounded, saving Solomon from the awkward conversation. "I know that noise. That was the ship's cannon firing." "Marcus left the outer defenses on when we left. Someone probably tried to reach the fighters in the hangar." The ship lurched again, throwing Solomon against the wall. Who the hell was piloting this thing? Now he knew why Marcus wanted them to hold on to something. "I have to say, this isn't his best rescue ever." Ayeka smiled. "Has he had that much practice? I mean, saving anyone except you and me?" Solomon laughed. "You'd be surprised. He might not act like it, but Marcus is a sucker for someone in trouble." The ship kept lurching, first one way, then the other. It was all Marcus could do to make his way down the short, curving ramp to the central command station. Both engines had failed and lights kept popping up on the damage control station. He needed to get the external monitors working so he could see what was happening out there. He stumbled, caught himself on the command chair, and slid into the seat. The control panel looked simple enough. He flipped a switch he thought controlled the main screen, and sure enough, it came to life. 2 monstrous ships with 8 arms protruding from a central cockpit like some sort of giant octopus tore at the hauler. Each of the arms ended in a different tool: cutters, bashers, metal shears, plasma cutters, and several other tools he didn't recognize were not so slowly reducing the hauler to scrap. It wouldn't take long before they did so much damage that the automatic mitigation systems could no longer maintain the atmosphere. He studied the control panel a little closer and found nothing that looked like computer-controlled weapons. Screw it. He got up and ran for the lift door. Another tremor about knocked him off his feet, but he caught the frame of the lift and pulled himself in. He hit the switch to take him back down and prayed he'd make it before those ships tore something that controlled the lift. The chime sounded and the doors slid open 2 levels above where he wanted to be. Staring at him, eyes wide and terror-filled, was Dorne Carrick. Marcus grinned at his luck and punched the horned prick square in the face. The old man went down hard. Marcus grabbed his ankles and dragged him into the lift. The doors shut, and the speaker buzzed and crackled as it tried to play the awful music. Once again, the chime sounded, this time on the correct floor. The doors slid open and thick, greasy smoke billowed in. Marcus crouched down under the noxious cloud. What the hell was burning? He grabbed Dorne's ankle and dragged the unconscious kidnapper behind him. He retraced his steps back to the prison room. No freaks presented themselves, and no one shot at him. Looked like the rats had abandoned the sinking ship. They had the right idea. Marcus stopped outside the door. "It's me. Don't shoot." Ayeka and Solomon waited just inside the door, him sitting and her standing. "You're okay." Ayeka hugged him. "What's going on with the ship?" "It's being torn apart. We need to go." Marcus looked around. "Where's the girl?" "Gone," Solomon said, his voice glum. "Don't worry about her. She was working for Dorne the whole time." Marcus grinned. "Speaking of Dorne," he stepped out and retrieved his now groaning prisoner. "I brought you a present." He pulled one of his blasters and offered it to Solomon, grip first. "He's all yours. Just make it quick. We're almost out of time." Solomon shook his head and pushed himself to his feet. "Let's take him to the council for a proper trial. Much as he deserves it, I don't want his blood on my hands." Marcus shrugged and hauled Dorne to his feet. The old alien staggered, but didn't fall. "Suit yourself. Let's go." He shoved Dorne out the door ahead of him. If anyone got shot, let it be the one who got them into this mess in the first place. As he feared, no one took a shot at the old crook. Well, they had a ways to go yet. Maybe someone would blast him and save them the time and trouble of a trial. The little group started down the hall, walking crouched to avoid the smoke. They hadn't gone far when they had to move close to the wall to skirt a pair of gaping holes in the floor. All around the holes were bits of bloody flesh and twisted metal. Those grenades had been worth the money. When they cleared the aftermath of the battle and reached the end of the hall, Marcus grabbed the back of Dorne's collar and shoved him toward the door to the hangar. Marcus paused to punch the deactivation code to the Star's external defenses, then shoved Dorne through. A charred, smoking, unrecognizable corpse lay on the hangar floor a few feet from the unconscious man. Marcus had no idea who or what it had been, but he saw no metal, just burned flesh, so it wasn't one of the freaks attacking them. A green bolt flashed through the smoke and splashed against the door a foot from Marcus's head. He leapt to one side an instant ahead of a second blast. Those looked like disruptor blasts. Solomon had warned him his captors had access to void tech. This certainly confirmed it. "Everybody down!" They dropped to the floor, Marcus and Ayeka both drawing their blasters. He scanned the hall behind them, looking for whoever fired that shot. They had to be in the hall. There was nowhere else the blast could have come from. Dorne tugged on his arm. "My partner has no legs. He flies on an anti-gravity unit." Marcus shrugged him off and glanced at Solomon. He mouthed the words ion grenade and pointed down the smoke-filled hall. Solomon held up a grenade the size of a plum and raised his eyebrows. Another green blast flashed above their heads. Marcus nodded and pointed again. Solomon pressed the primer and threw the grenade down the hall. A second later, lightning filled the hall, followed by a crash when their attacker slammed to the floor. The half-man tried to bring his weapons module to bear, despite the sparks shooting from its barrel. Marcus aimed his blaster, but the module exploded, tearing the man's arm off and saving Marcus from having to shoot him. Marcus leapt to his feet, then reached down and grabbed Dorne's collar. He yanked the old man to his feet and thrust him toward the ship. Ayeka and Solomon ran behind him, and Marcus brought up the rear. Solomon, Ayeka, and Dorne stopped by the ramp and stared at something. What the hell was the holdup? Marcus skidded to a stop beside the others. "Are you kidding me?" Debris filled the opening to the hangar. There was no way the ship could maneuver through that mess. Marcus ran his fingers through his hair. He couldn't catch a break. Choking down a string of curses, he said, "I can fix this. Everyone on board. Solomon, stun cuffs on our passenger, please." Solomon smiled for the first time since he found him slumped over his computer. "With pleasure." "I'll give you a hand," Ayeka said. The four of them went up the ramp. With everyone on board, Marcus sealed the ramp and ran for the cockpit. He dropped into the pilot's chair, powered up the anti-gravity generator, and retracted the landing gear. With micro-thrusts, he pointed the ship toward the closest of the two fighters and activated the tractor beam. Solomon and Ayeka joined him just as the first fighter rose off the ground. He guided it toward the jagged metal and girders, pushing it until the fighter lodged amongst the debris. "I thought the idea was to make the opening bigger." Solomon dropped into his chair with a sigh. "Criticizing already? It isn't that far back to your cell." Solomon waved his hands in a placating gesture. "What are you doing?" Ayeka asked. "Demolition work." Marcus punched a code into his gauntlet, and the bomb he placed on the fighter earlier exploded, followed a moment later by a bigger explosion when the fighter's missiles and fuel cells went off. The explosion finished off the force field maintaining the hangar's atmosphere. Debris, smoke, and everything in the hangar not nailed down or under power went flying out into space. The opening was big enough for two ships to fly out side by side. That big enough for you? Chapter 13. Marcus streaked out into space, happy to leave the disintegrating hauler behind. They hadn't flown over a second when the collision warning went off. He spun and yanked back on the throttle. An arm from one of the octopus-looking ships swiped through the space just ahead of them. Alarms shrieked when it raked them with a fan of plasma from its cutter. He rolled and hammered the throttle forward. "Fire up the cannons and give that son of a bitch something to think about." Solomon stared at the console in a daze. Marcus didn't have time to spare worrying about him. Despite his best efforts, the octopus ship was staying right on his thrusters. He rolled, avoiding another jet of plasma. "I've got them," Ayeka said from behind him in the auxiliary chair. A moment later, streams of energy poured from the ship's cannons, forcing the other pilot on the defensive. Marcus seized the moment and jetted toward open space. If he could just get a little distance, they could fire up the hyperdrive and get out of there. "Look out!" He was rolling again before Solomon finished speaking. The second enemy ship must have noticed the trouble its partner was having and decided to lend a hand. It wasn't like the hauler was going anywhere. "Which one do you want me to shoot at?" Ayeka asked. "Both." Sweat beaded on Marcus's forehead as he fought to avoid the second ship's arms while not flying toward the first. They were so fast. It didn't seem possible the ungainly things could keep up with him. How the hell would he get out of this mess? "Where's the second fighter? The one from the hangar?" Solomon tapped on his console. "The opposite side of the hauler. I'll put it on the screen." A flashing dot popped up off to Marcus's left. He pushed the engines to the red line and turned toward it. If this didn't work, he was out of ideas. In a straight race, he finally gained a little distance between him and the second ship. "Where's the first ship?" "Coming up fast on our right." The battle seemed to have burned the exhaustion from Solomon's brain, thank the galaxy. "Ayeka, focus your fire on the first ship. Keep it off us for another few seconds." "On it." The streaks of energy shifted to target the approaching ship. Up ahead, the drifting fighter drew him on. They should be close enough now. Marcus clenched his teeth, took one hand off the controls, and punched in all but the last digit of the code for the second bomb. They streaked past the fighter, and he hit the final key. The bomb detonated, engulfing the pursuing ship in a spray of shrapnel. Marcus climbed and spun them back around. "Switch targets." Ayeka shifted her fire again. The damaged ship took 3 hits, then exploded. Marcus pumped his fist once, then looked for the surviving ship. He found it fleeing back toward the space station. He started to turn in pursuit. Ayeka put a hand on his shoulder. "It's over. Let's get out of here." Marcus let out a breath. Part of him really wanted to chase down that second ship and blow it to smithereens, but Ayeka was right. They were safe now. He turned toward open space and throttled back to half power. Course plotted and laid in. In unison, they said, "Back to the Council." Marcus flipped the switch, and they shot into hyperspace. It took most of 3 days to reach the Council asteroid. They emerged from hyperspace, the massive asteroid filling the screen. Marcus let out a little sigh. They'd made it back, everyone in one piece. That was the best result he could have hoped for. "So what happens now?" Solomon asked. His eyes looked clear, and some of the darkness around them had faded. 3 days of near-constant rest worked wonders. "I imagine the boss will want to talk to Dorne, try to find out how those freaks got a hold of Void Tech. It's bad enough to have to deal with the Void themselves without everyone else in the galaxy getting their claws on their weapons." "I second that." Solomon glanced over at the empty seat behind Marcus. "What's up with Ayeka? She seems different. Looks like she's had enough of our lifestyle." Solomon's eyes widened. "Are you two—" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, pal." The comm unit crackled. "Welcome back, Rogue Star. Your hangar's empty and waiting." "Thanks, Control. It's good to be home." Marcus flew the ship around to their usual hangar. The doors stood open, a force field the only thing keeping the vacuum of space out. He eased through the field and, once the engines cleared, sent the command that closed the doors. After this little adventure, he'd think twice about not sealing the doors behind him. The docking clamps locked onto the top, bottom, and sides of the ship, securing it in place, then spinning them around to face the doors to allow an easy exit. They'd taken surprisingly little damage this time, just a little carbon scoring from the octopus ship's cutters. Their fuel, however, was down to fumes. It was a good thing he got free fill-ups as part of his unofficial salary. He powered everything down and got out of his chair. His gauntlet sat charging beside his station. Marcus unplugged it and strapped it on. They left the cockpit and found Ayeka standing in the hall. "Back at last." Marcus nodded. It was a relief to have everyone safe, but now they'd have to decide what their future held. He led the way back to the hold where they'd left the restrained Dorne lying on the deck, gruesome towering over him. If ever there was an incentive to behave, having the giant warbot towering over you was it. "Get up." Marcus nudged Dorne with his boot. The old man groaned but didn't move. Marcus looked at Solomon. "Want to see if the stun cuffs work?" "All right." Dorne scrabbled to his feet, his blue robe wrinkled and filthy from sleeping on the deck. He looked more like a refugee than a rich businessman. He glared at the three of them. "I suppose you're enjoying this." Solomon offered an enthusiastic nod. "I certainly am. I kind of hoped you might not get up so I could give you a taste of how the cuffs felt." Marcus grinned but held his peace. He walked over and lowered the ramp. "Let's go. I suspect my boss will want to talk with you." To his surprise, at the bottom of the ramp, a few feet away, stood Drakor, his silver mask and white robes gleaming. Marcus guided Dorne down the ramp with a hand on his elbow. "Hi, boss. This is Dorne Carrick, kidnapper, liar, and all-around slimeball. Despite his character issues, you're going to want to talk to him." The silver mask cocked to the left. "What makes you think that?" "His partners were using Void Tech. I saw at least one weapons module that came from an assassin. The universe knows what else they might have." "The universe may know." Drakor raised a gloved hand and pointed at Dorne. "But does he?" Dorne flinched under the cold regard of the first counselor. "I only know what I saw and heard. If I tell you, you have to guarantee me protection." "You'll find all our prisons very safe. Come along. There's a conference room nearby where we can talk." Drakor led the way out of the hangar and down a short hall. He took a left, passed several doors, and then stopped in front of the sixth. There was a control panel on the wall which Drakor used to open the door. Inside was an oval table with 8 chairs around it. Drakor took a seat and gestured for the others to do the same. Marcus steered Dorne into the seat closest to the first counselor, then took the one behind him for himself. Drakor leaned towards Dorne. tell me about these partners of yours." Dorne leaned forward in his chair to take the pressure off his bound hands. "The truth, sir, is that it's all his fault I fell in with such disreputable characters." Dorne jerked his head toward Marcus. Drakor looked to Marcus, who gave him the abbreviated version of his rescue of Princess Land. Drakor returned his attention to Dorne. "So you failed to force a wealthy girl to marry you against her will, and this is what caused you to fall in with your new partners." "Precisely, sir. I required capital for my business, and when I failed to get it in one place, it became necessary to get it elsewhere." The first counselor leaned forward so his mask was only a few inches from Dorne's face. "Be grateful that my people reject violence. If ever a person tempted me to violate my beliefs, you are him. Now tell me about your partners before I lose my patience." Dorne's face went pale. "They call themselves scrappers. They make money tearing apart derelict ships and selling parts and metal. It appears they make a great deal of money, as they had no trouble providing me with the 10 million credits I required, interest-free, I might add. It was only later I learned that sometimes they create the derelicts rather than just find or buy them." "So you took a loan from pirates," Marcus said. Dorne cleared his throat. "It turned out that way, but I didn't set out to do so." "When you put it that way, I guess we can't complain," Marcus said. Drakor shook his head. "Enough, Marcus. Where did they get their technology?" "I'm not certain. From what I've pieced together, someone used them in a variety of experiments, then when they didn't turn out as they expected, abandoned them. The ones I dealt with were quite bitter about the whole thing. These scrappers must be the failed void experiments Ayeka's old boss mentioned." Marcus frowned. What the hell would they have wanted with a feed from the council chambers? "Why did these scrappers have you kidnap Solomon?" Drakor asked. "They required a hacker to get them access to your camera feeds. They didn't specify who, just someone good enough to get the job done. I admit I selected Mr. Keyes. I figured as long as I had to get someone to do the job, I might as well cause a little discomfort to an old enemy. That turned out to be a poor decision on my part. Anyway, I overheard my partner talking to his master. It seems they wanted to learn when especially valuable shipments would be heading out so they could ambush them." "Did they mention how they planned to ambush them or where?" Drakor asked. "It seems they stole a device from their makers capable of dragging a ship out of hyperspace. They called it a hyperwave generator. I admit the science is well beyond me. The idea was to set up in a secluded spot on the target's route, force it out of hyperspace, and attack before they recovered from the surprise." "This is very important," Drakor said. "Do you know where the scrapper's master is located?" Dorne's lip curled in knowing smile. "If I did, what would it be worth to you?" "It's worth enough that if you don't tell me, I'll strap you into a brain scanner and rip the information out of your head." Drakor spoke in such a cold voice that for a moment Marcus thought he might do it. It appeared Dorne thought so too. "All I know is the name of a city. Sidwell, they called it." Drakor nodded. "Thank you." A moment later, a pair of Vensar in silver masks and white form-fitting battle armor entered the room. Drakor pointed at Dorne. "Take him to a holding cell." Without a word, the soldiers took Dorne by the arms and half-carried, half-dragged him out of the room. When they'd gone, Marcus asked, "What's a hyperwave generator?" Drakor sighed behind his mask. "Something that shouldn't exist. Our scientists came up with the idea centuries ago. They theorized that a ship could move even faster through hyperspace if they could generate waves to push it along. They believed with these waves they could travel to the next galaxy and return in a few years. Though the theory was sound, no one ever created a functional hyperwave generator." Is this something else Sarkin stole when he left your world? Ayeka asked. Apparently. And like everything else he ever touched, Sarkin has corrupted it, taking a potentially revolutionary tool and turning it into a weapon. I hate to ask you to go into danger again, my friend, but we can't allow these scrappers to retain possession of the generator. Marcus nodded. He'd seen this coming as soon as Dorne mentioned the generator. This is what you pay me for. If you can find Sidwell, I'll be happy to smash their generator for you. No, Marcus, you mustn't destroy it. I need you to bring it back intact. Marcus frowned. Wouldn't it be easier to destroy it? Once it's smashed, the scrappers won't be able to use it anymore. Problem solved. The problem is far bigger than a few unfortunate beings getting their hands on a weapon. Even if this is their only prototype, the Void have the knowledge to build another. We need to learn how it works so we can figure out how to counteract it. Until we know that, hyperspace travel will be at the mercy of the Void, and we both know how little mercy Sarkin and his followers possess. I can't argue with you there, boss. Okay, I'll get the star ready to move. I'll help just as soon as I get the spyware stripped out of the camera system. Solomon got to his feet. Shouldn't take me more than an hour. Ayeka stood as well. I'll see what I can dig up on the city of Sidwell. Marcus shot her an inquiring look. I thought you didn't want to do this sort of work anymore. She chewed her lip for a moment. I don't want to get shot at and run for my life anymore. But I've thought a lot about what you do on the way back from Dorne's. It's horrible, but someone needs to do it, and you have the best combination of skills to do it well. I can't go back in the field with you. It's just too much for me, at the moment anyway. What I can do is help with research. I'm good at it. I spent a lot of time in the library in college. I want to help, and this is the best way I can. Marcus grinned. I knew you wouldn't quit on me. Let's do this. Chapter 14. Korath was a planet on the brink. From their position in orbit, most of the largest continent filled the screen. Deep pits and shafts pocked the surface. Didn't look like much grew down there. No large patches of green to indicate fields or forests. According to Ayeka, 80 years ago someone had discovered some rare mineral Marcus couldn't pronounce, and a rush of miners, from huge megacorporations to individuals hoping to scrape a few ounces out of the ground, descended on Korath. The good news was no intelligent life evolved down there. The bad news was pretty much all the animals and plants died during the mining rush, and the ones that survived starved over the next 30 years. A lot of people made a lot of money over 50 years, and a lot more lost everything. Those unfortunates had no way off the near-dead rock, so they all clustered in the one city that remained functioning, more or less, near one of the few unpolluted rivers on the planet. It was an oasis of life on the dead world. Apparently it survived because the people who built the city did so on the ruins of a colony that some dead race abandoned 1,000+ years ago. The name of the abandoned city was Sidwell. Marcus wasn't sure what impressed him more, that she located the name of an ancient city on a mud ball of a planet he'd never heard of, or that she'd done it in about 5 hours. Marcus flew around to the dark side of Korath. The lights of the city glittered in the dark, making it easy to spot. How bad do you think this is going to be? Solomon asked. Marcus shrugged. About like usual, I suppose. That drew a wince from Solomon. That bad, huh? Marcus laughed and pointed the ship toward the lights. Part of him wished Ayeka had agreed to come along, but another part was glad she remained safe back at the council. Before they left, she'd kissed him in a way that made it clear she still had feelings for him. That alone had put him at ease, not to mention giving him another reason to come home in one piece. Scanners are clear. I don't see any weapons or combat ships. Marcus glanced up from the controls. They were in the atmosphere and approaching the city at just under Mach 1. He didn't want to blow out anyone's windows. It wasn't a good way to make a first impression. See anything that looks like a landing field? Solomon studied the scanners, then threw up his hands. There aren't any ships of any sort. There's a big patch of dirt about a quarter-mile outside the city limits. That looks as good as anywhere. What kind of city is this? They ought to have flyers of some sort. Marcus spotted the dirt patch Solomon mentioned, circled it once, and brought the ship in for a landing. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe I'll get a better idea once I reach the city itself. What's the atmosphere like out there? Solomon tapped at his computer. Thin, but breathable. If you're going in alone, you better wear your armor. He shook his head. The only way he'd find the scrappers was to talk to the locals, and he doubted they'd want to talk to someone in a suit of armor. Once he found them and got a feel for what he was walking into, he might come back and change. I'll scout it out in plain clothes first. Marcus got up and popped a tiny earbud into his right ear. I'll keep the channel open so you can hear what's happening. All right, be careful. Marcus grinned at the absurdity of that idea. Keep the ship sealed tight. Anything other than me comes close, shoot first, ask questions later. Roger. Good luck. Marcus patted Solomon on the shoulder and left the cockpit. It was a lonely walk back to the hold without Ayeka to keep him company. He loaded up with weapons, personal shield, gauntlet, and a data slate with a direct link to the ship in case Solomon needed to do any computer work. It was a new system they rigged up so Solomon could stay safe on the ship and still bring his particular skills to bear when necessary. It was safer for everyone, as Solomon in the field was as much a danger to Marcus as the enemy. Satisfied that he was as ready as he could be, Marcus left the ship sealed tight behind him. Sound check. Can you hear me okay? Loud and clear. What's it like out there? Humid. It looked so dry from orbit. I'm heading for the city. Out. Marcus trudged toward the lights. The dirt in the clearing crunched under his feet. Even from a distance, the city stank, a mixture of unwashed people, rot, and sewage. Marcus tried to breathe shallow. The air would only get worse as he neared the city. Overall, he rated this place half a step better than Rand and Prime. Beyond the clearing, tough, low shrubs whose leaves resembled saw blades grew in clumps. Marcus picked his way through them, not eager to see if those leaves were as sharp as they looked. Why couldn't whoever he was after ever live somewhere nice? Blue skies, sweet air, chirping birds, water that didn't dissolve his skin, and plants without razor blades for leaves. Was that too much to ask? Apparently it was, since lately it felt like he went from one death trap to the next. Oh well, no one ever said a life of adventure would be pleasant. He reached the edge of the city. There was nothing that said, "Welcome to Sidwell," or whatever they named the new city. The ground changed to a mix of broken pavement and dirt, and none of the razor-leaved bushes seemed to grow in the city. The buildings were a mix of well-built, low cement towers and ramshackle wood and metal additions tacked to the sides by whoever built them. Code enforcement seemed quite lax. Even stranger, Marcus hadn't seen a single person. Lights burned in a few of the windows, but even if it was night, you'd think there'd be at least a few people outside. Walking through the empty city gave him the creeps. He'd been walking for a while, trying to find a sewer access or tunnel or something that would take him underground, when a series of low groans reached him. He stopped and listened closer. Where were they coming from? He turned his head to the right. Definitely that way. The groans didn't sound pained, rather half asleep. Like him, when he first woke up after a hard night of drinking. Had he located the largest group hangover in history? Marcus followed the groans to a low, rough-built single-story building. Light spilled out a doorway with nothing but a pair of swinging half-doors to keep out the weather. It looked like a bar. That would explain the groans, except it was too early in the evening for hangovers to set in. Curious, Marcus put a hand on the grip of his blaster and pushed through the doors. If it was a bar, it was the weirdest one Marcus had ever seen. 20 patrons sat in recliners, staring at nothing and groaning like a chorus of the damned. Aside from the people in their chairs, the inside was empty. Marcus pulled his blaster. Something stank, and it wasn't the garbage on the streets outside. He walked over to the nearest chair. An emaciated Terran major, his fur falling out in clumps, sat staring straight ahead, a little trickle of drool in the corner of his mouth. Marcus waved his hand in front of the alien's unblinking eyes. Nothing. No reaction of any sort. He snapped his fingers a couple of times, and still got nothing. There's something weird going on here, pal. Marcus described the scene. Sounds like a drug parlor, Solomon said. I thought about that, but they're not hooked up to anything. Marcus turned the Terran's arm over and parted the fur around his elbow. No needle tracks or bruising. They might use some kind of pills. Use the probe in your slate to get a blood sample. I can analyze it and tell you for sure. I'm not sure it's important. It'll only take a second to get a drop of blood, and I'm curious now. Please. Marcus shrugged and got the slate out of his satchel. After what Solomon went through, he'd humor him this much. The probe slid out of a slot on the back of his slate. He pressed a button on the rear of the little pin-looking thing, and a needle popped out. He poked the Terran Major's arm, and the needle sucked up a bit of blood. Marcus slid the probe back in and hit transmit. I got it, thanks. Marcus put the slate away and walked to the far end of the building. On the wall beside a second door, a gray metal box hung about head high, a thick cable running out of the floor into it. It looked like a breaker box, but this place only had lights, so it hardly seemed necessary. A smaller black cable ran out the top of the box and out the ceiling. Marcus shook his head and pushed the door open. He couldn't decide if this was important or a waste of his time. On the roof directly above the box, a satellite dish pointed toward the center of the city. At what he estimated was the exact center of the city stood a tower covered with satellite dishes, each pointing in a different direction. It wouldn't have surprised Marcus to find one of them pointed right where he stood. The blood's clean, Marcus. Whatever's wrong with them, it isn't drugs. Can you scan for all transmissions in the city? There's a tower in the center of the city, and I think it's transmitting something to this building. Just a sec. Marcus imagined his friend's fingers flying over his keyboard. I'm picking up something, but it's flowing to the tower, not the other way around. Now completely confused, Marcus tried to understand the situation and failed. What the hell was happening? Footsteps and rustling from up the street caught his attention. Marcus ducked back inside and pressed his back flat against the wall. He waited, hardly daring to breathe, for a few minutes before poking his head out the door. A void assassin in black battle fatigues walked down the street. Its flat, black mask pointed straight at the tower. The sensors in their masks must let them detect whatever signal Solomon picked up. It looked focused on the tower. Whatever was happening in this city, that tower was the center of it, and not just geographically. Marcus let the assassin get a good lead, then slipped out to follow him. It didn't look like he'd have any trouble. The masked figure walked in a straight line towards its target. As long as it doesn't turn around, Marcus figured he could walk down the middle of the street without a worry. He wouldn't, of course. For all he knew, there might be more of the killers wandering the city. Slipping from shadow to shadow, Marcus followed the void assassin for 3 blocks before it paused and raised its masked head. Marcus ducked into a doorway and kept still in the deep, dark shadows. Hardly breathing, praying Solomon wouldn't choose that moment to talk to him, Marcus waited for the assassin to move on. An energy blast streaked in from an unseen weapon and skipped off the assassin's shield. The assassin came to life then, raising its weapon module and firing a burst of green disruptor energy at whoever shot at it. Another blast streaked in from the opposite direction, doing the masked man no more harm than the first shot. There were at least 2 snipers out there, but if they had nothing more potent than blaster rifles, they wouldn't last long against the assassin who spun to fire a blast of green energy at the second sniper. Marcus debated helping the snipers. At this range, he could put a blast through the assassin's mask with no trouble, but he didn't know who was attacking. He'd feel awfully stupid if he killed the assassin only to have the snipers turn their weapons on him. Better to let the assassin deal with the snipers than follow along behind. The snipers alternated bouncing shots off the assassin's shield for a minute or so before it got impatient, fiddled with its weapons module, and fired a micro-missile at one of the snipers. An explosion near the top of one of the towers preceded a body falling to the ground. 1 down. After the missile, no more shots came from the remaining sniper. After a few seconds, the assassin appeared to decide it was safe to move on and walked down the road just like nothing had happened. Once the assassin moved a ways down the road, Marcus ran over to the dead sniper. A near human, his legs replaced by steel pillars ending in tank tracks, lay in a blood spatter 8 feet in diameter. So the scrappers were here after all, and the Void knew it as well. It seemed they were in a race to claim the hyperwave generator. This was a race Marcus had to win. Chapter 15. Marcus crouched behind a pile of concrete and bent girders across from the tower. Up close he counted 20 dishes pointing all over the city. He would have bet good credits each dish pointed at a building like the one he found earlier. Why, he still had no idea. Gathered around the base of the tower stood half a dozen Void assassins. The one Marcus followed was the last to arrive. Either no one attacked the others or they dealt with their opponents faster. "I'm not detecting any ships." After Solomon recovered from the shock of hearing Void assassins were wandering the city, Marcus told him to scan the area for any sign of their transport. "If they're stealth-capable like us, or they just powered down their reactor, I might not pick them up." And it'd been a long shot anyway. The Void were too sophisticated to get found that easily. "That's okay. Keep your scanners working. If reinforcements arrive, I need to know." "Got it. Watch your back." Marcus wasn't worried about his back. The killers were in front of him. How could he get into the tower with Void assassins surrounding it? He had a shield, penetrating blasters, and good cover. He might take all 6 assassins by himself, but the prospect didn't thrill him. Adventure was one thing, but that was suicide. He was still debating when crimson blaster bolts came streaming out of the base of the tower. Judging from the size of the bursts and the fact that they all skipped off the assassins' shields, the scrappers must only have hand weapons. That would slow the assassins down, but not stop them. Behind him, something clunked. Marcus scrambled to find a better hiding spot. He nestled into a narrow gap between 2 slabs of broken concrete. A moment later, 3 scrappers carrying rocket launchers ran past his old hiding place. Marcus grinned as they ran past. Those would get the assassin's attention. When the scrappers had moved out of sight, Marcus worked his way free of his hiding spot and retraced the scrappers' path. If they had a way out of the tower, he could use it to get inside. Beyond the rubble was an alley between 2 partially collapsed buildings. He searched around, checking the ground and peering into the rundown buildings. There had to be something. There! A flat stone halfway up a pile of rubble with a wet boot print on it. Marcus clambered up the pile and looked over the back. A clean spot in the floor marked the location of a hatch. The scrappers had knocked all the dirt off of it when they came out. An explosion sounded behind him, rattling the walls and sending dust raining down on him. They'd put the rocket launchers into play. He jumped down beside the hatch. How the hell did you open it? Marcus groped around the edges, ignoring the crud on the floor oozing between his fingers. His hand sunk into a depression, and a few feet further on his other hand found one. He pulled, groaned, swore, and after a moment pried the hatch up and swung it open. Bent over and gasping for breath, Marcus looked down the dark opening. A crude iron ladder, its rungs hammered into the stone of the tunnel, provided a sketchy way down. Marcus wiped his filthy hands on his pants and climbed. It was a nerve-wracking thing, reaching 1 foot down into the darkness, hoping to find another rung. Slow and methodical, he made his way down, always keeping 3 points of contact and easing his weight onto each rung. At last his foot hit ground instead of a rung. He let go of the ladder and shook his aching hands. He'd gripped the rungs tighter than necessary. When the feeling returned to his fingers, Marcus switched on the light in his gauntlet and got his first look around. The walls, floor, and ceiling were rough stone. He couldn't decide if it was a tunnel the scrappers built especially as a secret exit, or whether they tapped into an old sewer line. It made little difference. He swept the light across the floor and soon found their tracks in the dust. Whatever its purpose, they didn't use it much. Marcus followed the scrappers' back trail through the dark, his little light inadequate for the amount of darkness around him. The tracks ended at a blank stone wall. Great, another secret door. He felt around, pressing any protrusions or dents, hoping one of them would release the door. He groped around a couple minutes before something gave under his hand and the wall slid back and to the side. Beyond the wall, a dim, bluish light filtered down from the ceiling high above him. Marcus shined his light around. The old, almost primitive stone of the tunnel gave way to shining metal floors and walls. Above him, the ceiling was so high he couldn't make out any details. The room was round and empty, the floors so spotless it looked like someone had polished them. Marcus stepped away from the tunnel door, and it slid shut behind him. Marcus frowned. He didn't want to go back that way, but it would have been nice to have the option. The blue light seemed sufficient, so he turned off the flashlight in his gauntlet. A quick circuit of the room turned up nothing but smooth metal walls. The sounds of the battle outside didn't penetrate the room. It must be sealed tight to keep out the blasts of the rocket launchers. The silence unnerved him more than the dark tunnel. Marcus couldn't remember a time when no sound reached him. It was unnatural. He moved to the center of the room, and a tremor ran through the floor. A circle appeared around him, and the floor sank, carrying him deeper under the tower. He looked up in time to see the circle of blue light seal behind him, sinking him once more into total darkness. He scrambled to get the flashlight switched on. It proved unnecessary. After a couple seconds of darkness, more of the blue light sprang to life. All around him, 15 strange aliens, with tiny, withered bodies and giant heads, sat floating in individual cells, surrounded by what looked like an electrical storm. The aliens had large eyes, but no other sensory organs, and no mouths. How did someone survive without a mouth? The lift continued its leisurely descent, giving him plenty of time to study the odd beings. They didn't look like scrappers. None of them had any mechanical parts, and they certainly didn't resemble any sort of void creation he'd seen, judging by the lack of killing implements. "Solomon, can you hear me?" His voice sounded so loud in the silence. A few seconds with no reply confirmed his fear. He was too far underground to maintain contact. Shit. At least the big-headed aliens didn't seem interested in him. Once in a while, a bolt of electricity struck one of them in its huge skull, and it would arch its back and shudder. Whether in pleasure or pain, Marcus didn't want to know. Time passed. He didn't bother checking his watch to see how long, and at last the lift passed through another opening and into a cavern filled with electronic components and lit by bright white lights hanging from chains attached to the ceiling. Good thing Solomon didn't come with him. He'd never have gotten him away from all the gizmos. The lift settled into a raised platform with a short flight of stairs down to the stone floor. Looked like his ride was over. He climbed down the 3 steps and wandered through the heaps of stuff. He recognized some of the items: hard drives, cables, data chips, and other components. There were bins full of nuts, bolts, and other fasteners. As he walked through the piles, Marcus understood what this place was: a repair shop. This must be where damaged scrappers came to get fixed after a battle. If any of them survived the void, he suspected they'd need a great deal of repair work done. That begged another question. If this was their repair shop, where was the mechanic? Marcus continued to move through the piles. There seemed to be no end to them. Everything looked precariously balanced, and he dared touch nothing for fear of getting buried. As he approached what he thought was the middle of the cavern, flashing lights from an active computer terminal caught his eye. He headed towards it, hoping to find something besides piles of junk. The computer terminal was attached to a massive processor, perhaps 15 feet high and 10 wide, with dozens of old-fashioned whirling hard drives. There was a monitor with an old office chair in front of it, but no sign of a person to sit in it. The only bit of technology he didn't recognize was an odd metal orb that looked tacked on to the top of a server rack they'd converted to hold a bunch of daisy-chained CPUs. The screen flashed, and a face constructed of geometric shapes appeared. "Sit down, Captain Drake. We have much to discuss." Marcus stumbled back a step and stared at the screen. "How do you know my name?" "I know more than your name. But more important, you are an enemy of the Void, and that makes you a potential ally." "This would work better if we spoke face to face. Where are you?" "This is the only face I have, and I'm right here beside you." The orb vibrated, and the metal sheath slid back, revealing a brain floating in a clear dome. "This is all the Void left me after they finished their experiments." Marcus shook his head and sat down. A brain hooked to a computer. Wonderful. "What are those big-headed guys up above? Are they another of the Void's experiments?" "No, those are the Ka Rea. You may think of them as our landlords. They let us live in their city in exchange for bringing them fresh sources of sustenance. Sustenance? Marcus didn't like the sound of that. Yes, they're a fascinating species. The Karea derive nourishment from the psychic emanations of other species. Good emotions or bad makes no difference. They came to this planet during the rush to feed on the highs and lows of the miners. Later they provided the city to those too poor to leave the planet. When we arrived, the population was in decline, and we agreed to provide prisoners from the ships we take. In exchange, they let us stay here. How could they stop you from staying? They don't look especially formidable. Not physically, the brain said, but they can affect your emotions, turn simple anger into overwhelming rage, sadness into suicidal depression. Despite our mechanical portions, we still, for the most part, retain our minds. That made us vulnerable to their powers. In the end, I think the bargain worked out well for everyone. Marcus's stomach churned at the matter-of-fact way the scrapper spoke. I doubt the people I saw strapped to those chairs would agree. It no longer matters. The void have come and our time on this world is over. Why don't your friends upstairs use their powers to turn the assassins away? The void assassins are little more than meat machines. Their masters have altered them to the point they feel no emotions of any sort. The Karea are powerless against them. We will fight them, but we can't win. I wish to strike a bargain with you, Captain. Given the bargain the scrappers struck with the creatures above, Marcus didn't know if he was interested in making a deal. Of course, he had no way out and no idea where the generator was, so a deal might be a good idea. I'm listening. I will give you the hyperwave generator and safe passage out of here, in exchange for you warning the rest of our colonies that the void have moved against us. A simple enough bargain, wouldn't you agree? It was simple. Too simple. Why don't you warn them yourself? You must have a transmitter here. Indeed I do, Captain. However, the void cruiser in orbit is jamming all transmissions, and we have no ships capable of eluding it. I and all my brothers and sisters on this planet will die today. But if you agree to help me, many others may be spared. Marcus got up, paced in a little circle, and then nodded. Deal. What do you need me to do? A data chip popped out of a slot in the terminal in front of him. This contains a list of all the channels we use and their encryption keys. Broadcast a warning on all the frequencies using the correct keys, and my people will get the warning. Marcus took the chip and put it in his pocket. The generator? The brain sphere rose up on 6 mechanical legs, giving it an insect-like appearance. It clattered down from its pedestal, the tips of its legs clicking against the metal frame. Follow me. The voice came from speakers below the sphere. The sphere clicked along through the piles of junk, moving deeper into the cavern. It moved along at a good clip for having such short legs. They reached the rear of the cavern and stopped. A box with a small dish sat on a steel pillar. The thing couldn't have been more than a foot square. All this trouble for something so small. Marcus picked it up and grunted. It was heavier than it looked. You mentioned a safe way out? Yes. This. The brain trailed off. What was the holdup? The Void Cruiser has deactivated its cloak and powered up its weapons. I believe they have decided retrieving the prototype is no longer worth the effort. The cavern shook and gravel rained down on them. Planetary bombardment? Correct, Captain. You should hurry. This cavern is deep in the earth, but their weapons will reach us in short order. What about you? Marcus's question surprised him. We have nowhere to go, and no way to escape the void. A tentacle snaked out of the base of the sphere and pressed a section of wall. Another secret door slid open. Hurry, Captain. Save my people. Marcus nodded, tucked the generator under his arm, and ran down the tunnel. Chapter 16. Marcus switched on his light a moment before the tunnel sealed behind him. In the barely adequate light, he found himself in a tunnel much like the one he took to reach the tower. They probably ran all over the place under the city. Another blast shook the tunnel, and Marcus picked up the pace. The last thing he needed was to get buried under a city. The tunnel ran mostly straight, sometimes curving a little to his left, but no branches presented themselves. 5 minutes later, he reached another set of rungs hammered to a stone wall. He flashed his light up at the ceiling. Another hatch waited 20 feet up. Getting it open might be a trick if it weighed as much as the last one. Marcus clambered up the rungs. They felt sturdier than the first set he climbed down. At the top, he put his shoulder into the hatch and straightened his legs. It rose easily, and the rung he stood on held rock steady. The moment he cracked the seal on the hatch, the rumble of explosions reached him. He climbed clear of the tunnel and found himself in an alley between a pair of undamaged buildings. He ran to the end of the alley and turned back to face the tower. Crimson streaks rained down like lightning, blasting the tower and the surrounding area. The cruiser had blown the dishes off, and the top half of the tower itself lay in a pile beside the base. Flames shot out openings lower in the structure. As he watched, another blast streaked down from the sky and blew a chunk out of the side. He shook his head. In a couple minutes, there'd be nothing left but rubble. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Solomon sounded frantic in his ear. "Yeah, relax. I'm fine, and I've got the generator." "That's great, but the 3 Void Assassins prowling around a couple 100 yards from the ship won't let me relax." "Where have you been? There's a cruiser pounding the city from orbit." "Underground, and I noticed the bombardment. It was kind of hard to miss." "What should I do about the assassins? I can take them easy enough with the ship's cannons." "No." Marcus had a moment of near panic. "Whatever you do, don't lower the cloak. The second you do, the cruiser will spot you, and then we're screwed. Hang tight. I'll deal with the assassins. I'm about 20 minutes away if I hurry." "You'd best hurry then, because if they get much closer, they'll see the shimmer of the cloak and call it in." Marcus flipped off his flashlight and jogged towards the ship through silent streets. All the scrappers must have fallen back to defend the tower, and the only other people in the city were sitting catatonic in overstuffed chairs, so their brainwaves could feed a bunch of now most likely dead aliens. Marcus hesitated. Should he try to collect the prisoners? The ones he saw didn't look in very good shape, and who knew what mental damage they'd suffered? No. He had to get back to Solomon and get the generator to Trakor. A blast of green disruptor energy shot out of an alley to his left and missed him by a foot. He dove toward the alley, hoping to cut off the assassin's angle of attack. He rolled, popped back to his feet, drew his blaster and ran on. Marcus skidded to a halt beside the left-hand building and leveled his blaster. A second later, a black mask appeared in his sights, and he fired. As advertised, the blaster penetrated the assassin's shield and blew its head to bits. Marcus grinned. He'd have to thank the boss for such a useful toy. "Solomon, are the 3 assassins still there?" "Yes, but they're all looking away from the ship. That's probably because I just killed one of their buddies. Are they moving my way or just looking?" "Just looking for now." "Good. Tell me if they move." Marcus ran away from the alley and started on a long loop that would bring him to the ship from the opposite side from the assassins. The rough streets made it tricky to run without losing his footing, but he didn't dare slow down. If he could get to them before they lost interest in their dead friend, he'd have a huge advantage. Dirt and razor ferns indicated the edge of the city. In the dim starlight, the field where he landed the star was just visible. If he didn't know he'd landed there, he'd have no idea his ship sat just a few 100 feet away. Marcus slowed, both to catch his breath and so the assassins wouldn't hear him coming. He set the generator down and pulled an adhesive grenade out of his satchel. He didn't want to risk damaging the stupid thing now that he'd almost gotten away with it. Marcus pulled the pin, but held the lever down. He eased closer, and one of the razor ferns sliced his pant leg and the skin beneath. He stifled a curse and kept moving. Crouching to shrink his silhouette, Marcus peeked across the clearing. 3 Void Assassins milled around as though uncertain what to do next. He'd never seen the black masked killers acting uncertain. Well, he didn't plan to complain about his good fortune. He threw the grenade, which landed right in the center of the group. They looked down at it an instant before it blew, sending streams of industrial adhesive spraying over the unfortunate assassins. Stuck in place, their weapon arms immobilized, the assassins squirmed, trying to wriggle free. Marcus finished them with 3 well-placed shots. Before he could board his ship and run for his life, he jogged back to where he left the generator and collected it. He used his gauntlet to lower the ramp. It looked like it appeared from nowhere. Marcus raced up the ramp and closed it behind him. The generator fit snugly in one of his storage bins. He snapped the lid shut and ran up to the cockpit. "You got it?" Solomon turned toward him when the door slid open. Marcus nodded. "Locked down and ready to go." "Great. How are we going to get out of here?" Marcus activated the anti-gravity generator and retracted the landing gear. "Very carefully." He turned the ship away from the burning city and flew toward the opposite side of the planet. With minimal thrust and staying as close to the ground as he dared, Marcus did everything he could to avoid attracting the attention of the huge black void ship raining death down on the planet. When the curve of the planet blocked them from the enemy ship's scanners, Marcus shoved the throttle forward and shot into orbit. "Course laid in," Solomon said. Marcus pulled the lever and they accelerated into the swirling vortex of hyperspace. "Here it is." Marcus handed the generator to Drekor. They stood in the first counselor's personal lab, surrounded by enough technology to make Solomon drool and Marcus's head ache. They'd made it back to the council asteroid without trouble, thank the universe. He'd had enough trouble for a few days at least. "I thought it would be bigger." Drekor hefted the box, then held it up to examine the connections on the underside. "It connects to a ship's hyperdrive and modifies its function. The ship provides the power and most of the hardware." "So it's like adding a sound suppressor to your blaster." Drekor nodded. "Something like that. You've done a great thing retrieving this. Once we determine how it works, we'll be able to mass-produce a countermeasure and deprive the Void of a potent weapon." "Do you think you'll make your hyperwave engines work with this?" Solomon asked. "It'd be cool to see what's in the next galaxy over." "It may help, but the technology works on two different principles." He shook his head. "This isn't my area of expertise." Solomon nodded, a little frown curling his lips. "What about this?" Marcus dug the data chip out of his pocket. "Should we warn them or let the Void clean them up?" Drekor took the ship. "You promised the scrapper leader you'd warn the others." "Yeah, but at the time I'd have promised him just about anything if it got me out of there in one piece. This might be one of those occasions where letting the Void do what they want may work out for us. Of course, I don't know if all the scrappers are violent. Some may live peaceful lives out in the middle of nowhere." Drekor nodded. "We will warn them. I wouldn't wish the Void's revenge on anyone. What will you do now?" "Ayeka needs a lift to Alpha. We'll hang out there for a few days. I haven't visited the little guys in a while, so I'll probably play deity for an afternoon. After that?" Marcus shrugged. They shook hands. "Take your time, and as always, excellent work." Marcus led the way out of the lab. The door closed behind him, and Ayeka came running around the corner. He grinned. Man, she was a sight for sore eyes. She hugged him, and she sighed. Ayeka still cared. He could feel it in the way she trembled in his arms. "I was so worried," she whispered in his ear. "I'll meet you two on the ship." Solomon fled back to the hangar. Marcus kissed her. "It'll take more than a few scrappers, void assassins, and a cruiser to keep me from coming back to you." She slapped his chest. "Don't joke. You could have gotten killed." He took a step back and held her at arm's length. "That's the job, and I'm good at it. I think everything I've done has led to this job, working for Drekor, dealing with some of the big problems out there. I can't tell you how satisfying it is. That won't keep me from worrying." Marcus slipped an arm around her waist, and they started down the hall toward the hangar. "I know. And I love you." She stopped and spun to face him, her eyes wide and shining. He nodded. "I love you." She hugged him again. "I love you too." Solomon rushed away from Marcus and Ayeka. It wasn't that he wasn't happy they were happy, but he didn't need to watch. He took the back passages to the hangar, meeting no one. The door slid open, and he found the techs still refueling the ship. Solomon waved to them and went up the ramp. He probably had a little while, maybe a long while if Marcus found an empty closet on his way back. Solomon went to his room and fired up his slate. When it had connected to the net, he tapped his messages and a new note popped up. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the signature. The Queen of Hacks. Emily made it off the ship in one piece. Solomon sighed, not sure why he cared, but glad she'd made it all the same. He started to tap the message, then stopped. He didn't want to know what she had to say. Not yet. It was enough that she was still alive. Perhaps he wouldn't send that virus after all.
I hope you enjoyed Children of Junk. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my uploads. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.